Well, hi there, space freaks, space fans, and space adventurers. Bill Whittle here with the Stratosphere Lounge number dun 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 74. 74. Excuse me while I take the boat down a couple feet by the keel. That's better. How's everybody doing out there? It's good to be here. Good to be back. Missed a week getting ready for things, and we'll tell you a little bit about that before we get going on our very special Stratosphere Lounge space episode, which I'm enormously looking forward to, I have to tell you. I like the theme episodes. They're kind of fun. And we got some great questions, too. Yeah, let's just catch up a little bit on what we've been missing, and then we'll get into this show, because I do love this stuff. I got a couple pictures this time. Nothing absolutely amazing, but great questions and fun stuff to talk about, and so on. I guess probably what I'll start off with obviously we start off with a Hail Vectron. Thank you, Silent Gloves, and happy birthday, by the way, by Vectron's Golden Claw. I'll never get tired of the Vectron thing. I never will. If you haven't seen it, it's the Michelin Web Monday. It's on BillWhittle.com. They did a sketch called Vectrons, just about the best sci-fi comedy sketch I've ever seen. Anyway, it's good to be here, and this may be episode 74, may be the last Stratosphere Lounge episode from this version of the Stratosphere Lounge. We are looking like we're going to move into the new office. We might start moving stuff in as early as Friday, but we're in. So it's just a question of whether we can get the internet hooked up in time for next week's show. I think we probably can. I'm going to do it on Tuesday if I can. Next week's show might be a little dicey. Speaking of a space episode, next week I am heading up for the 4th of July to spend with my friend Bert frickin' Rutan. Be the third 4th of July in a row that I've done that. I go up and visit him, and I'm never going to get tired of saying things like that. You know, it's one of the things that I'll just never get tired of saying. But yeah, you know Bert Rutan, the guy who built an airplane that flew around the world unrefueled, and then decided he wanted to fly in space, so he built his own vehicle and his own space program and everything else. So that'll be fun, and we come back and talk a little bit about Bert a little bit later. But next week, I'm hoping to do the show on Tuesday. If not, it's going to have to be pushed back until the following week, because I'll be gone Wednesday through Saturday, I guess. So that'll be fun. But this, as I said, might be the last episode in the... it likely will be the last episode in the old lounge. Next week would definitely be the last episode if it's not this one. Got our new offices painted. We've got new carpet in, so I'll see if I can do another walkthrough. I might be able to do that tomorrow. Actually, no, I don't know if I can do it tomorrow. Anyway, over the weekend, start moving stuff in. We got a lot of stuff to move in and got a loose stuff to get up and going. Funny, somebody mentioned Lori and Greg Adams said get a Kirk chair. I'd love to get a Kirk chair. They made those reproduction chairs that I think they're like $4,000 or $2,000, $3,000, but they're expensive, but they look great, and I'd love to have one. Funny you mentioned that, though, because we won't have it ready by next week. We may not have it ready for another couple weeks, but as I mentioned in the walkthrough of the new place, much bigger place, enormous place, really, compared to where we are now. And we're going to have one wall with the Stratosphere Lounge mural on it. That will definitely not be ready by next show. But I'm going to put a couple of chairs in there, and I found some kind of really groovy modern chairs that don't look exactly like the Kirk chair, but they got enough of a Kirk chair feel for you guys to kind of get the vibe. So I think that'll be fun. So we'll probably have a show or two that are going to be kind of like, temporary shows. Then we'll get that new backdrop in, and that's going to be just gorgeous. Absolutely fantastic. So we're very excited about that. Otherwise, things are moving along. We had to, doing these firewalls once a week basically tripled my long format output. I was doing 2 afterburners a month, and now I'm still doing 2 afterburners a month, but I'm doing 4 firewalls a month as well. So that's been keeping me busy. But we've been talking about the new office forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. We can't do the dailies members only content in this room. The office that we're in now is occupied by a bunch of people, a lot of shooting going on. So fairly quickly, we should have the ability to do that new dailies members only content. I was thinking about a good launch date. I was hoping to make it 4th of July. We're not going to get there. But maybe 20th of July, speaking of a space show, might be a good date. That would be, 45 years since the pinnacle of human achievement, which we're going to have to beat again. And we'll come back to Free Frontier and all that other stuff in the guts of the show. But anyway, just want to let you know, get a good look at the Stratosphere Lounge as it currently exists, because it's going to get much cooler. And we've had some fun in this room and done some really good work in this room. And I'm going to miss this room a lot. But we'll see. Maybe we could take up a pledge drive for a Kirk's chair. It wouldn't be my chair. I would just use it. Maybe we could do that. Because I got to tell you, that'd be a badass way to do the Stratosphere Lounge, wouldn't it? From the Kirk's chair. I'm going to have to give that some thought. We might have to Kickstarter that or something. I have to see about that. The thing about moving into a new place, we're certainly not rolling in money, but we have some resources. You don't want to go crazy and buy everything you want at once. You really have to pace yourself and just keep adding things, get the place you want over time. But it's going to be terrific. So anyway, we got another full show, fun show to do today, and today is our space episode. So I thought what we might do before we get into your questions is to show you a couple pictures. I think I put one of them up on my website. This was from about almost 2 years ago now. I have some friends up at a company called X-Core in Mojave, and I've done. They were in the Free Frontier video I did on private space a couple years ago. The first essay I wrote in Silent America that I just loved was called Trinity, and that really kind of inspired it. They invited me up to see the engine test. That would be about 10 years ago now. And so the people up there are terrific. They're just my favorite people in the whole wide world. And about 2 years ago, they invited me up, and I'll show you some pictures, because they were having a spacesuit fitting. Because unlike the government, these guys are planning to go back into space. Although I did see, can somebody correct me on this in the comment section? I thought I saw that they are about to test a Constellation capsule, the Orion capsule. I thought that whole program had been canceled. Is NASA putting together a manned space capsule? I didn't think it was, but maybe somebody can tell me. In any event, X-Core is building a vehicle called the Lynx. And the Lynx is a 2-seat, single-stage to suborbit. And thank you, by the way, everybody's commenting on today's Firewall. I had mixed feelings about that. It was kind of a saucy one, a little different, kind of funny and more upbeat. All opinion, Anyway, thank you for the kind words about the Firewall, because it was about America, and it's about going back to doing things and, having fun. By the way, I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try it. As I said, worst produced show on the internet, but I think it's probably worth it if I can find it. For those of you who haven't seen that, I can't do it. I turned the drive off. I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah. This, as I said, it doesn't really matter. The Ustream Producer is one of the least robust software packages in the world. If I turn this hard drive back on, it'll probably crash the whole thing. We don't want to do that. I was going to play that Cadillac ad, which I used in the Firewall that's on the Facebook page today. But anyway, this whole idea about that Cadillac ad was that Americans are always... this is what we do. We do hard, difficult things. I think probably a good way to start the space episode is to say this. In that Cadillac ad, which I referenced, and which is in the current Firewall, he says something, the character says something that when I first heard it, I thought actually bothered me. It actually kind of pissed me off a little bit. There's 2 lines in there back to back. They're the 2 lines that I used in the show. And he basically says, he's talking about American exceptionalism, basically. And the first line, the one that kind of bothered me a little bit, was he said, where they said we're crazy when we decided to go to the moon. So we went to the moon. You know what we got? You know what we got when we got there? Bored. And then he said, we left a car up there, and we left the keys in it. You know why? Because we're the only ones going back there. That's why. When he said we left the keys in the rover because we're the only ones going back there, I lost my mind. I just lost my mind. I loved it so much. I loved it so much. It was my favorite thing I think I've ever heard. Like I said at the beginning of that Firewall video, I remember feeling that good about America for 5 years. And the fact that it was that actor's McDonough, I want to say his name is, the fact that the guy was, that actor was in Band of Brothers, it was incredible. But let me just come back to the first line he said, because as I said, the first time I heard it, it really shook me. It actually kind of hurt my feelings. And then I started thinking about it, and then I realized, no, it's genius. It's genius. He said, Americans went to the moon, and you know what we got? Bored. And I thought, that's true. It's true. And then think about it. Just think about that. This country is so amazing that we not only went to the moon, but we went to the moon so many times that we got bored with going to the moon. America got bored about going to the moon. Wow. That's just amazing. Anyway, I don't think NASA's going back into space. I don't think NASA's ever going to put another man in space. I don't think there's the money. I don't think there's the political will. I don't think there's the technological competence. When I look at what happened with the F-35, the space program and the F-35, they're all part of the same thing. They're part of the same procedure, same procurement. The guy, Neil McDonough, thank you, he's terrific, was the actor. Thanks, David Wellman. I know I'm a little rambly here, but I'll settle down. I don't think NASA's going back into space at all as NASA. And the reason they're not is because if NASA touches it, it's going to be too expensive. And the reason it's too expensive is because of the way we do procurement now with this cost-plus procurement. There's a man I admire very, very much named John Boyd, and I've talked about Boyd many times. He was the kind of a rebel in the fighter mafia who developed the F-15, and then they started globbing up the F-15. So he said, all right, well, they've ruined the greatest air-to-air fighter of all time by adding all this air-to-ground stuff on it, although the F-15 still got a kill ratio of 172 to nothing. So then Boyd and his acolytes went on to design the F-16, which was going to be what they wanted the F-15 to be, which is a rapier-quick, lightweight air-to-air fighter. That's all. No ground attack, no none, just air-to-air fighter. So he developed the F-16. Anyway, one of the people he worked with was a guy named Spray. And I've forgotten his first name, but somebody will have it in a second. Spray's an American patriot and a genius. He worked on the A-10. He worked on another excellent airplane. He worked on the F-16. And Spray was the primary guy that turned the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle from a death trap into a pretty decent piece of hardware. Spray was the guy who basically said while the Bradley was being developed that the military, our military, was testing this fighting vehicle out with when they do a test to see if it would survive a RPG attack, they filled the gas tanks on the Bradley with water. That's pretty shocking when you think about it. So anyway, Spray's a hero of mine as well. So I saw an interview not too long ago. Somebody sent me a link to it, and it was Spray talking about the F-35. And Spray said he'd been calling it a turkey, and I'd come to that conclusion, but I don't have anything like Spray's operational situational awareness. I mean, he understands the Pentagon, understands the stuff on a much deeper level than I do. But Spray said something about the F-35 that I liked. It applies to the space program, so that's how we'll get there. Spray was asked about the F-35 and its mission. He said, well, as far as an air-to-air dogfighter goes, it's crap. And the reason it's crap is because it's got a tiny little wing. The F-15 has so much wing that a wing came off. They had an air-to-air refueling accident. Israelis lost a wing. They lost the right wing on an F-15, and they were still able to land the airplane. It has so much lift. The F-35 has a very little wing for a number of reasons. First of all, it needs to have a little wing because it's got to go vertical, and it has a little wing because of various other reasons. The plane is very, very wide because you have to have that vertical takeoff and landing fan in there and so on. He said with a wing that small, the plane can't turn because turning in any airplane is just lift applied at a bank, at an angle. So he said it's not a good, in fact, it's essentially useless as an air-to-air combat fighter in terms of a dogfight. It's essentially worthless there. He says, as far as delivering ground support ordnance, which is another mission of the F-35, he said since the airplane is supposedly stealth, it has to carry all of its weapons internally. You can't carry that many weapons internally. If you look at an F-16, F-18, F-15 Strike Eagles going on ground attack missions for strike packages, These planes are just loaded under the wing, just everything under the wing. Every station, every pylon is just filled with ordnance. You can't do that on the F-35. He said the F-35 is very fat and very draggy because it had to have the vertical takeoff capability that the Marines say they absolutely needed. Spray's not convinced they need VTOL. I'm not either. He said the plane had to be able to land on carriers, so there was reinforcement that the airframe needed that the other services didn't need. And Spray's point basically was, he said, the reason the A-10 is such a great airplane, that was the final thing he said, by the way. And as far as ground support goes, to replace the A-10, the plane can't loiter. It has a tremendous fuel burn. It sucks a lot of fuel, and so it doesn't have a lot of time over the target. And likewise, because the wing is so small, the plane has to fly fast to generate the same amount of lift with less area. And since the plane is flying fast and can't turn, it's a terrible airplane for being over the battlefield. You can't fly slow enough to pick out ground targets. So it is in every way a failure, and I am leading to a point here. So Spray said basically the plane sucks at air-to-air combat. The plane is not effective, terribly great in vertical takeoff and landing. He says, didn't see any reason for that. He said you can't carry a big bomb load for making it a fighter bomber because the weapons have to be carried internally. He said it's too fast to loiter over the battle space for anti-tank missions or anti-personnel missions. And finally, he said, and stealth doesn't work. Stealth works against Doppler-type radars, doesn't work against old long wavelength radars, and the Soviets are building those, and so the stealth doesn't even work. This is the guy who designed the A-10. He said the A-10 and the F-16 were designed for specific missions, and they were excellent at those missions, but the F-35 tried to be everything to the Air Force, and then in addition to trying to do every mission that the Air Force wanted it to do, it had to do all of the missions for the Navy and the Marines and all the overseas customers. So the point of all of this is, the interviewer said to him, so, Mr. Spray, you're saying the F-35 is a bad dogfighter. Yep. It's a poor bomber. Yep. Its stealth is not really very effective. Yep. It's incapable of doing the ground support mission. Yep. And so she said, well, Mr. Spray, what is the mission of the F-35? And Spray said, the mission of the F-35 is to spend money. That's what the F-35's mission is to spend money. And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. The mission of the F-35 is to spend money, is to take hundreds and hundreds of billions, it's probably pushing $1 trillion from the taxpayers into the defense industry. People should know me well enough to know by now I'm about as hawkish as they get. But the fact of the matter is that our national security is compromised and will be for a long time because of this disaster. Not only have we paid a fortune for an airplane that doesn't do any of the missions it's supposed to do, but think about what that money could have done otherwise. The F-22, on the other hand, is a pretty good air-to-air superiority fighter. We could have bought a lot more of those. We could have bought a lot more A-10s or refurbished the A-10s. We could have gone with systems that we know to work. But the military brass wants gold-plated new stuff, and the defense contractors are more than happy to get there. Somebody just said, Zachariah Thomas says, talking about space, and here we are talking about airplanes. We're talking about aerospace. It's the same thing, really. So when you find out that's how the F-35 debacle happened, then you begin to realize that's what has happened to the Constellation program with Orion and what was the other piece of it? Ares. The NASA and the government will go to the primes, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and they will ask for a vehicle, and it will be trillions of dollars, and it will be 6 years or 8 years late, and it won't work. So if we're going to go into space again, we're going to go with private individual space programs in the same way that every single aviation company that was great company started with the individual vision of the people that started it, usually the person that started it. There's a reason these companies are called Lockheed and Martin and Boeing and Cessna and Lear and Hughes and, all these guys, Northrop, individuals. So all this to say that X-Corps is a very small group of people, and they make decisions, and they fly cheap and safe. They get the best hardware they can for the lowest price because they don't have unlimited budget. They don't get paid to spend money, but Lockheed does. The more they spend, the more they get. So that may seem like a long roundabout way to say things, but it's important. It's important for everything we're going to talk about today in terms of where the future of this country's space program is coming from. It's not going to come from NASA. I don't think it's going to come from the primes. I really don't. I think it's going to be SpaceX, X-Corps, Bigelow, these guys. Anyway, about 2 years ago, they were doing a fitting for their suborbital vehicle called the Lynx two-person, side-to-side, single-stage to suborbit vehicle. They tow it out to the runway. They light the rocket engines. The thing goes down the runway like a little pistol, takes off, rotates to some insanely steep angle. It looks like it's 60 degrees or something. And the Lynx is light enough and well-designed enough so that with one passenger on board, pilot in the left flying, passenger beside him on the right, that will get you into outer space. You have 4 or 5 minutes of weightlessness on the top. You come back and glide down to the landing. You put in more liquid hydrogen, I guess it's alcohol, and liquid oxygen. I know it's a non-toxic fuel. They were very determined to do that. And go up and do it again. You just do it all day if you want to. So they were doing a spacesuit fitting. And I've been using Dave Clark headsets. Well, I don't have any now. I use Bose, but I'd use Dave Clark. Dave Clark is legendary headsets for general aviation. Turns out they make spacesuits. So they had me up there fitting for my for spacesuits for the crew, and they had a couple different sizes, and they had all the text there, and they said, would you like to come up and get in an actual real spacesuit? And I said, yes, I would. I have some movies of this, but they were shot on an iPhone by a friend of mine who shot them vertically, and they wouldn't import into this format. I'll probably convert them, and we'll do them someday soon. But I have a couple stills, which I wanted to share with you. While the details of the spacesuit are kind of cool and interesting, the only really reason I'm showing you this is because I just think you need to see the expression on my face, because this is a lifetime dream of mine, and getting into an actual, real, honest-to-God pressure suit was a big deal. So let's have a look at a couple of these things a couple years ago. That's me in the suit. It's a pretty happy expression on my face. Underneath that suit is it's not a full cooling vest, but I mean a full cooling suit, but there was a vest that was filled with cold water, and I'll tell you what, without that vest, you couldn't survive in that thing. It gets warm in there. We put on the Snoopies here. The communications things, headsets are built into that, and there are actually 2 different kinds of helmets that we tried on here. Let's see if I can find this one. I don't know really how to describe this. I guess the best way I could describe it is this way. One of the helmet setups are set up so that you wear a skin-tight thing around your head that they used to call the Snoopy anyway. I don't know if they still do. And the helmet is essentially loose. The helmet takes pressure, obviously, but there's a tight seal around your face where this thing wears. And I like that much better. Another version has your face actually sealed to the inside of the helmet, which I didn't like as much, to be honest with you. And I got to make these movies because the movies of me getting into this thing are really, really cool. They're just fun. And then, let's see. There's your humble narrator in the actual mock-up of the vehicle that they were just building. They put us in the suit to do some tests. They wanted to find out that the pilots could reach all of the controls and that they could do all these things. By the way, we have the best lag I've ever seen today. We're almost in real time today. Wild Goose asks if the boots are part of it. Yes, they are. There's a series of actual booties. It's like little footies on a pair of pajamas, and the footies are pressurized. And so they go into actual boots, and then you kind of put the boots on the top there. And I'm going to, you know what, I'm going to convert those movies, and maybe we'll do another space episode. Maybe we'll do it next. Because you really need to see those movies. Because I'll tell you what really did shock me. I'm hooked up to a cooling thing here, but I'm not hooked up to oxygen or air or any kind of pressurized air. So when the techs brought that visor down and sealed it, the pressure visor, the inside visor, all of a sudden when you start breathing, you can feel it in your ears because you're now in a balloon. You're living in a self-contained pressurized balloon. And without suit air coming with you, once you got that visor down, you can breathe comfortably for about a minute or two, maybe a little less than that, because then it's like being under the covers. You're just breathing the air that's in the suit and the helmet. That's all the air is in there. So probably after 20, 30 seconds, you start getting a little uncomfortable. After 40, 50 seconds, you got to get that visor open because you start to feel like you're suffocating. This picture's a little further away. Some of you have seen it on my Facebook page, but I don't know if it's clear enough, but you really need to see the expression on that kid's face to appreciate just how happy I am there, because that's a happy, happy, happy boy. So there's yours truly in an actual by God spacesuit, actual by God pressure suit. Made my day, week, month, and year. Thank you, X-Corps. I'm going to ride in that vehicle. I got a good feeling I am. When I was trying out the suit, I said, I'm flying in this thing, I'm flying. And they've known me for a while over there. I love those people. And they said, okay, well, talk to their chief pilot. I want to say it's Nick Searfoss, former shuttle pilot. And I said, when I say I'm flying in the vehicle, I don't mean I'm flying as a passenger. I mean I'm going to fly the thing. I'm going to fly the vehicle. You have a talk to Rick. And I said, have Rick put some flight tests together. I'm a great stick. I can handle this. I'm a glider pilot. I have hundreds of hours in gliders. I glide that thing to landing. No problem. No problem. X-Corps is moving to Texas out of California along with everybody else. And I'm way overdue for a trip to X-Corps. I think maybe when we get the office set up, we'll go up and do an X-Corps episode of Stratosphere Lounge or something special, something like that, because I'm way overdue. But anyway, that's my spacesuit stuff, and that is a happy camper. And I'll do the movies. The movies are just so much better. I try to just drag them in, but because they were shot vertically, the Ustream is stretching them out, and they just didn't work. So I have to convert them. But in any event, it was pretty cool. In fact, it was very cool. Thanks, X-Corps. That was a dream come true, and I think there's probably more where that came from. All right, so let's get to some questions here. It's funny. We got the topic was space, and I think we got one astronomy question, maybe two. The rest of them were technology questions, but I love the astronomy as much as anything. But let's start with this one. It wasn't the top ranked one, but I liked it a lot because it came with a picture, and it was from Jennifer Kearns-Lechner, who says, what do you think is going on with this nebula? How does that ever happen? Well, I'm sure most of you know that what we're seeing here is the end stages of nova or supernova. That gas cloud is called a planetary nebula. That's what astronomers call it, as opposed to more like a gaseous nebula. In astronomy, we really have two different classes of nebulae, although they really are just different stages of basically the same life cycle. What's happening here is that star in the center is dying, and it's throwing off masses of its outer atmosphere and its surface out into space, and it's blowing out this giant bubble. Now, usually, these bubbles are more or less round, and that's where it got the name planetary nebula, because the first astronomers looking at these things through telescopes, they just look like little dim disks. They look like distant, dim, round planets. So that's why they call them planetary nebulae, although this one's obviously not very round. Sometimes the star will shoot out these two lobes like this. It's got something to do with the rotation. It's also got something to do with the actual way it explodes. I'd be willing to bet those are on an arc off sideways, and I'd also be willing to bet that this is a cross section. That in fact this is not a two-dimensional thing so much as we're looking at it two-dimensionally, that it's more like a torus, I would imagine, than these two lobes. Sometimes they do shoot off lobes, though. So it's just a particularly exaggerated example in terms of its sort of symmetry. But this kind of thing is fairly common for large stars. So this is somewhat different than something like the Orion Nebula, let's say, although, as I said before, it's all part of the same life cycle. Basically what happened was when the universe was created, the first stars were all hydrogen stars. They were all red stars, bigger and dimmer temperature-wise, although there's still thousands of degrees, but much dimmer than today. And so this whole population of stars, these initial stars, lived out their lives, burned their hydrogen, fused it into helium and some other heavier elements. And then at the end of their life, when they run out of hydrogen, they start burning some of the helium they've created. That's a lot more energetic. The star gets hotter and so forth and so on. And ultimately, these larger stars anyway, the novas and supernovas, explode. And as they explode, they push this gas out into space. And over time, this gas dissipates and then under its own gravitational field reassembles. And then as it reassembles, it looks more like the Orion Nebula. It doesn't have this kind of structure. It's the result of several stars that have previously exploded. But this particular gas lobes that you see coming off of this star have more heavy elements in them than the original star had to begin with. In other words, the gas that's coming out of this dying star has elements that weren't there in the gas that formed the star billions of years earlier. The star made the heavier elements using fusion. It's one of the oldest, most hackneyed things in the world, but it's also one of the coolest things in the world. It's been said so many times, I'm actually embarrassed to say it because it's almost a little too hippy-dippy, but the fact of the matter is it's true, and it's also awesome. And that is that everything you see and touch and feel, including ourselves, all of this was manufactured inside of stars. We genuinely, truly are stardust. We genuinely, truly were. Those heavy elements that make up the carbon and iron in our bodies, and all the iron and carbon and silicon and everything else, was created inside of first generations of stars that exploded, coalesced into second generations, and so on. So that's an astonishing thing, really. That's absolutely astonishing. And one of the many things about astronomy that give you so much perspective. We have a great question about that perspective thing coming up. One of the other couple little things that I might just mention about this picture, just for those of you who like hearing these kind of things. The first thing is that this is enormous, absolutely enormous. Certainly much, much larger than I would imagine than the solar system. Most of these are very, very big. They're large, large, large clouds of gas and dust. That's number one. Number two, and this is something that nobody seems to realize, you certainly, as much as I loved Wrath of Khan, these guys sailing through clouds, is just not true. What you're seeing here, including the Orion Nebula, which looks very dusty and very kind of thick and milky, even if you look at the densest of these nebulae, you have to understand that you're looking at objects that are light years across and light years deep. In the middle of that nebulae, it's much better than the best vacuum on Earth. The densest part of this picture is many times scarcer than the best vacuums that we can maintain on Earth. So even though it looks kind of dense, and even though the real deep, dusty, nebulae with a black kind of look to them is much, much, much thinner than a really good vacuum on Earth. You're looking at light years of density, of depth. So that's the second thing. And finally, the third thing I'll say, and this is really disappointing, I'm sorry to say, but that is that whenever you look at these beautiful pictures of these nebulae and you see the incredible images that come from Hubble, and you see the Orion Nebula glowing red and blue and all this other stuff, and you think if you had your telescope out, you'd be able to see all this stuff, but you just can't. And I'm quite sure that even with the biggest telescopes in the world, you can't. These are the results of time exposures. And sad to say that the Orion Nebula, which is beautiful, through a telescope is just essentially a slightly gray-green smudge. The bigger the telescope is, the more detail in the smudge, the more of it you can see. The darker the sky is, the more of it you can see. But you don't ever see through a telescope what you see in these images. And that, I have to say, is heartbreaking. And I suspect, I'm quite sure of this, even if you got close to them as you do in these science fiction movies, if you sailed right up against these things, you wouldn't see the brilliant reds and yellows and oranges. You'd just see slightly less gray than black space. That's how thin they are. So in some level, when we talk about space exploration, so much of what we see and so much of the settings that we set our space operas against, it's not only a question of not being able to get there, it just doesn't exist. Those clouds don't exist in that kind of density. You see these guys sailing through nebulae and banking and turning through the clouds of dust and all this. No, sorry, no. It's just not there. And even if you were right up against the Orion Nebula, the Orion Nebula is 1,400 light years away. It's a long way. If you were 20 light years outside of the Orion Nebula, it wouldn't fill the sky with this giant glowing red spider that we're all used to. It would fill the sky with a giant gray-green glow, maybe like a weak aurora. Hate to be the person to break that to you, because it sucks. It's just bad news. The Andromeda galaxy, which was called a nebula because in early telescopes looked just the same little smudge. The Andromeda galaxy is the nearest large galaxy to ours. We have two satellite galaxies called the Magellanic Clouds, the only visible in the southern hemisphere. Tiny little irregular dwarf galaxies that orbit the Milky Way. But the next closest big galaxy is the Andromeda galaxy. It's larger than the Milky Way. It's the largest galaxy in our local cluster. That's 2.5 million light years away. But when you see it through a telescope, it's just a little smudge. But if you could actually see the full extent of it, it's much, much wider than the moon. I think it's something shocking. It's something like 5 or 6 lunar diameters or something. It's just huge. But we can't see it. And if you fly right up against the Orion Nebula, got real close to it, like in that Star Trek episode where they're heading towards the Orion Nebula, you see it out in space. Well, you're in space, so of course it looks like the pictures. No, it just looked like a gray amoeba, just a gray, smoky little dust cloud. Because how do we know this? Well, we know this because we know that galaxies don't look like our time-lapse pictures of galaxies if we get close enough to them. And the reason we know this is because we live in a galaxy, and we see the inside of a galaxy every single dark night in this planet, and it doesn't look like that. The Milky Way is the cross-section of our local galaxy. When I was teaching astronomy in the Miami Planetarium when I was 13 years old, I think I came up with this analogy. I said, it looks like a pancake, and we're inside the pancake batter. If you imagine yourself inside the batter of a pancake, you can look around sideways. You look up, it's clear. You look down, it's clear. But you look around sideways, you see nothing but pancake and a band around the sky, and that's the Milky Way. And the Milky Way, as you know, is just a very diffuse glow. Against a black night, it's impressive and stands out, but it's not what you see in the time-lapse pictures. So that universe doesn't exist. It's not like we can't get there. It just, you're looking at time-lapse photography, long exposure photography. So, sorry to break that to you. Anyway, that's an interesting little picture. Thank you, Jennifer Kearns-Lechner, and we liked it so much that I decided to take the next question from Jennifer Kearns-Lechner, who says, I think the first trip to another star system will wait until we have the technology to at least approach the speed of light. Generation ships are problematic in so many ways, and what's the point of that kind of commitment if humanity could develop warp drive before the ship arrives? What do you think? We have three kind of domains in that question. There's the much slower than light domain, which means that a ship traveling at the best speeds that we could put together today using chemical or nuclear rockets might take 100,000 years to get to the nearest star. 60,000, something like that. So the idea of a generation ship is you're traveling so slowly that the people live and die in the spaceship. It's basically a self-contained little world. And you have a generation that launches from Earth, and they wave goodbye, and they die, and their kids grow up and live on the ship, and they die and live and 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 die. And hundreds of generations later, you get to the destination, and that group of people on the ship get to colonize the planet. I don't see any way where that would work. I don't see any way where you could maintain the life support on something like that. The bigger you make something, the harder it is to move it. The thing about big bat problems that I like, I think probably of all the things I like in that movie, is the idea that Earth is being invaded, being colonized, and the aliens send a mothership, and the mothership is the size of a softball. Because the less mass you have, the easier everything gets. So the generation ship is an interesting idea, but I don't really buy it. Suspended animation is the idea that you would basically have one crew at launch and one crew, the same crew at the destination, and you would basically find a way to suspend them, keep them alive at either zero metabolic rate or a very low one. And when I was writing Aurora, I did a year's worth of research on this subject. You often see suspended animation lost in space. You step into a tube and so on, and sometimes you see them kind of, in a little force field thing appears in movies that are more serious, like the Alien movie or Aliens. You see people lie down in beds and they kind of get pressure sealed, and you can tell it's cold in there, so we know that we're making them colder, which is in fact a good way to keep your metabolic rate down. And it looks like this new movie, which is coming out, Interstellar, looks like they're taking that kind of thing even better. They're submerging them in liquid, which is a better way to support your body weight, and and all kinds of other interesting things. But suspended animation, at least in the way we understand that term, is just magical. It just doesn't really exist yet. Having done some research on this, I can tell you what does exist. The lower you get the body temperature, the more the heart rate and the oxygen, the respiration rate both go down. And the metabolic rate slows down, but it doesn't stop. I mean, you might go down to 6 heartbeats a minute, down from 60, 40, 50, 60 at rest if you're very calm, 80, 90, 100 if you're a little more excited, and 120 if you're really thrilled. So you can slow it down. But one thing that I did find that is interesting is that if you expose mammals I want to say it's sulfur dioxide. I had the research. I'm pretty sure it's sulfur dioxide. Rotten egg smell, I think that gas. If you expose them to a small percentage of it, it's 16% or something like that, breathing sulfur dioxide actually does dramatically slow their metabolism down. And if you combine that with low temperatures, then you can get to a point where people are out for relatively, they're down. And so when we're talking about a mission to Jupiter, what I basically was doing, I had them set up so that they were doing all three. The best way to get I'm talking about current technology now, the best way to get people unconscious and keep them unconscious is to put them in a medically induced coma. We do this all the time. When you have burn victims, people who are in enormous amount of pain and had skin grafts, and they basically just have to lie still and heal for 6 weeks. They just put them in a coma, a medically induced coma. They keep them on sedation. Same kind of anesthesia that you would use for surgery is a slightly lower level. And so in Aurora, having given this very serious thought, I had a mission that was about a year. It was about 11, 12 months out and about 13, 14 months back. And the main reason I wanted those people unconscious was because I did all of Aurora as if I was going, as if this was a practical problem I had to solve. So you do save on the foodstuffs and the supplies, and you save on oxygen, although if you got a reactor, you probably make your own oxygen. So you save on consumables, rather. And there's some other advantages to have people unconscious. If you put them unconscious, you can keep them in a little crypt, basically, and rather than having to shield the entire ship, if most of the crew is spending most of their time unconscious in a bed, basically, you can just shield the bed. So that helps a bit with the radiation shielding. The more shielding you put on a ship, the heavier the ship gets. The more heavier the ship gets, the more fuel you have to carry to get the same delta V. The more fuel you have to carry, the more fuel you have to carry to advance and accelerate the fuel, and then you have to carry more fuel to slow the fuel down, and then so on and so on and so on. So what I did in Aurora was I did all three. I had a doctor, the guy who's in charge of the hibernation of the crew, is in fact a medical anesthesiologist. He's an anesthesiologist, and he is a guy who spends his medical career keeping people in a state of sedation. So what they did was this guy in his lab, this doctor, fictional doctor, in his lab was experimenting with dogs and hamsters, and he had a hamster that lived, for like 7 years, and so what he does is he basically gives him a shot, like you'd get if you're about to go into surgery. He hooks up a little catheter into the wrist, and he says, I'm going to give you some lovely drugs now, and the room starts to spin, count backwards from 100, 99, 98, boom, they're out. Once they're unconscious, he adjusts the oxygen and sulfur dioxide rate, puts a little sulfur dioxide in there that absolutely starts to slow the metabolism down, and then he basically takes their temperature down to about 60 degrees, their core temperature down to about 60 degrees, and then your heartbeat goes down to 3 beats per minute. Respiration goes down to about 1 or 2 breaths per minute. And you can keep people down for a long time that way. The problem is you feed them through a tube, and you have to worry about getting the waste out. See, this is the thing that I try to do with Aurora's so-called suspended animation. I wanted to make it messy, because it is messy. It's extremely messy. You have to feed people through a tube. You keep a tube in somebody's mouth or in their throat long enough, that's horrible. Bed sores are an issue. I had these beds actually rotating because the ship has centrifugal gravity for the people that are awake. So you got that thing, and you don't want them in weightlessness anyway because their bones start to atrophy. So it actually rotates like a rotisserie so that they're not constantly on the same side. You develop bed sores that way. You got to feed them that way. You got to keep them hydrated. You got to keep the drugs going into them. You got to keep the sulfur dioxide going into them. You got to keep the temperature down. Got to do all these things. Got to be monitored. And so I basically figured that on a mission of 2.5 years, that what they would probably do is they might do 4 to 6 down and 2 up. That was the way I looked at it. You have a crew of 7 on that show, and what the basic premise was once they got past lunar orbit and they were in cruise mode, at any given time, they would put 3 or 4 of those people down and leave 2 or 3 up. Doctor was always awake. He was kind of a loon. He was the kind of guy who liked to study Chinese, and he perfectly happy to be in solitary confinement for the rest of his life because he's just a complete intellectual. And I was actually thinking of getting Dwight Schultz to play that kind of a weird sort of mad scientist kind of thing. But basically what happens is you would, one of the things that you show them doing is before they go in and one by one start going down for the first time into this hibernation state, they give them the diaper, and there's various tubes that have to be attached, and so that's not pretty. They have to have tubes down their throat. That's not pretty. So when you see them there, they're not lying there like Ripley, in their little cloth underwear, calmly sleeping. The thing they got. They got tubes taped to their mouth. They look like people that are in the intensive care unit. They got tubes taped to their mouth. They got tubes going in their arms. They got tubes coming out of them in various places. And it's uncomfortable. And when they wake up, when they finally wake them up, they're incapacitated for a day or two. The first 6 hours, they're utterly lost. I've had general anesthesia probably twice. And because I'm always curious in the procedures and how they work and stuff. So the one thing I remember both times about being under general anesthesia was asking the doctor, is everything okay? Did it turn out okay? And having them say both times something to the effect of, for the 8th time now, Bill, yes, everything came out just great. So your memory's shot, you're physically ill and weak for a day or two. You're probably throwing up. It's ugly. It's a messy, ugly, gross thing to do. But it's cool, and it's believable, and I think that's really the answer. So that'll get you, let's say you could put people out for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, a couple months. If you keep them out much longer than that, you run into the problems that you have with people who are in medical comas for months and months and months and months. Body starts to atrophy, bed sores, problems, everything just goes south on you pretty quick. So I figured 6 weeks down, 2 weeks up, 6 weeks down, 2 weeks up. Get them back up, get them into shape, get them on the treadmill, get them on an exercise bike, work them out, get them back to normal, then plunk them down again. That kind of thing, or some variation on that thing, would probably get you through the solar system. You'd probably be able to get most of the solar system. Vipercheck wants to know which version of Dwight Schultz, Lieutenant Barclay, the only coward in Starfleet, or Howling Mad Murdoch. It won't be either of those, but it'll be more like Barclay than Murdoch. He's the perfect guy for this. He's the perfect guy. He's alone on the ship for most. A lot of times he's the only guy awake. On the way back, he is the only guy awake because the ship's all torn up and we've lost some people, and he wanders around naked. Because why wear clothes? That kind of thing. Anyway. That kind of thing could probably get you through the solar system. And as technology advances, we might find what it is about sulfur dioxide that's doing it. I think a very promising way to look at suspended animation is through genetic modification. Bears hibernate, and some other animals do too. And they go into an actual genuine hibernation, and needless to say, there's no one pumping drugs into bears or chemicals or any of that stuff. The bears have a genetic component that activates when certain temperature and lighting conditions and all that other stuff happens. And they go into a deep and effective sleep. And the great thing about what we're learning about genetics is that so much of this stuff is interchangeable. If you have a gene that turns on spots on a frog, for example, and you transplant that gene onto fruit flies, then they start developing spots on their wings. And that kind of thing really is remarkable. So I think if you started getting into this seriously, like you had an actual space program and an actual series of places to go, you'd start getting into the genetic thing, and then you could probably find a way to have your body turn itself damn near off. Coupled with the technological boost, you could get people in much better shape there, I think. This business about stasis fields and stuff, I just had a rule for Aurora, and that's no magic. No matter how much I wanted something, I couldn't, if it wasn't feasible engineering-wise, then it wasn't going in there. So that's it for the hibernation thing. So generation ship, I think, is out of the question. The question is faster than light or relatively high sublight. A generation ship, by definition, is a sublight ship, but it's not even close to speed of light. If it's taking centuries, even forget 10,000 years or 100,000 years. If it's taking more than 100 years to get someplace, it's a generation ship. You're moving pretty slow. So let's deal with the faster than light thing, and we'll save the good stuff for last. Up until a couple of years ago, the first half of my life, I was utterly convinced that warp drive was just a matter of time. Faster than light travel, I thought there were lots of different ways to do it. One of the things I thought of as a kid, now I don't know if this is unique. It's unique to me. I hadn't read it anywhere. But I thought, if space-time is actually one thing, if space-time is a single thing rather than space and time, and space-time is a single thing, time is moving through the fourth dimension. I had a thought that was kind of interesting, and that thought was if you could drop yourself out of time, it didn't matter how fast you were going. You could throw a baseball to Alpha Centauri. If that baseball was not moving through time, then it didn't matter. You literally just stop the time on the vehicle and turn it on again when you get there. That's different than relativistic time dilation. I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, but then for the last 15, 20 years, I thought it was absolutely impossible, because I'm almost sure it is absolutely impossible. I have to be careful about wishful thinking. Of all the things that science fiction writers and readers and techies and space kids and all, of everything we want, the thing we want most is faster than light travel. And because we want it so bad, it makes us prone to believe it's going to happen. Up until very recently, it seemed to me that whatever experimental shreds of evidence there might have been for being able to travel faster than light through a wormhole, let's say, you find out that in order to open the wormhole, you have to have more energy than 10,000 solar systems create, and the wormhole is a couple of molecules wide, and there's no way to aim it or steer it. And frankly, it just started to feel like, yes, theoretically, I suppose this might be possible, but that doesn't mean it's possible or doable. And I still think that's the case if I had to bet. If I had to bet, I'd say that faster than light travel is technologically impossible. Although, as we'll find out a little later on in the show, maybe not. So I think faster than light travel, at least for the foreseeable future, and when I say the foreseeable future, I mean the foreseeable future. We're looking at energies unimaginable, really. I say it doesn't exist, and I don't think it's going to exist. Which leaves us in the world of sublight travel at relatively decent speeds, which is attainable. As many of you know, Einstein's theory of relativity predicts many things. And these have been proven experimentally. It's not up for discussion. It's not like global warming where there's a computer model that says that this might happen. We've put extremely accurate clocks in airplanes, and we put a couple of extremely accurate clocks in orbit, and they do, in fact, slow down. And time slows down for you when you're on an airliner, slows down for you a little bit more if you're in orbit. And your time slows down for you a little tiny bit if you're traveling on the 405 freeway at 20 miles an hour. But obviously, these are utterly insignificant. A second, if you're traveling in orbit around the Earth, somebody probably knows the exact answer, but if you're moving at orbital speeds, the time dilation is so slow that you might pick up a second every 100,000 years, something like that, right? So the problem with the time dilation, which is good, if you start going faster and faster and faster, time slows down for the crew. That's good. That's great. If you traveled at 99% of the speed of light, time on board the ship would really crawl, and you'd turn on your speed, your sublight speed drive, and get up to high relativistic speeds, and next thing you know, you're there because the time is slowed down for you. That's awesome. That's great. The problem with that is that the time slowing down, the time dilation, is more or less linear with the increase of the mass of the ship. So as you go faster and faster and faster, your ship gets more massive. And it does three things. Time slows down, the ship gets heavier, more massive, and it compresses along the vertical axis as it gets shorter in the direction in which it's headed. None of this is perceptible to the people on the ship, obviously. That's why it's called relativity. But the problem with that is that as you get faster and faster and faster, your ship is essentially heavier. I'm going to say more massive, but for the sake of the argument, I'm going to say heavier. It's a little easier term to understand. More massive is the correct term because weight is only mass in a gravity field. But the ship gets heavier. And the problem with that is that it takes a certain amount of push to move a 10-ton ship. And if you have to move a 1,000-ton ship, you need a lot bigger push. And if you have to move a 100,000-ton ship, you have to have a much bigger push than that. And if you have to move a 1,000,000-ton ship, that's an even bigger push. And that ship is getting heavier and heavier and heavier, more and more massive, as you get faster and faster and faster. So what I deduce from this is that even if you could get there in terms of the propulsion, you're not going to get time dilation effects of any magnitude, because once you start getting time dilation effects, you start getting mass increase effects, and mass increase is the end of the world as far as propulsion is concerned. Now, I am assuming that this is all reaction-based rocket-type propulsion systems. We'll get into those in a minute. There might be reactionless drives that invalidate all of this. If that happens, they probably require more energy than we could produce. But let's say that, look, there's always something that could happen that we don't know about. I'm just talking about what we know about today. A reactionless drive, something that just moves from here to there for warp reasons or whatever, is a game changer, and we can't speculate on that. So that does leave us with one option, and I think this option is actually a viable option. I think if we're talking about interstellar travel, I think the most likely way for it to happen, if it ever does happen, is to develop some of the technologies that we have on the board today. And if you were to use everything right, you probably could get a ship up to 20 or 30% of the speed of light and slow it down again at the other end, 30 or 40%. Let's say 50%, because 50% is a nice number. At 50% of the speed of light, you don't have any noticeable time dilation effects. They're exponential, so is the mass gain and foreshortening and everything. At 50% of the speed of light, if you could get immediately to 50% of the speed of light, you would be in Alpha Centauri in 9 years. Given some of these, look, people could live for 9 years. People have done 9 years in prison. So even without putting the crew under hibernation, your suspended animation, whatever you want to call it, you could probably get a crew there. So I think it's actually feasible. So let's say 50%. That's a tremendously difficult thing to do. To give you an idea of how tough it is to get up to 50% of the speed of light, my understanding is, there are people out this smarter than I am, but in order to get to the speed of light, if you didn't have this mass increase effect, if the speed of light was just a linear thing that you got to, you'd have to accelerate at 1g, which is a rocket that's pushing down, accelerating fast enough to give you 1g worth of weight on the floor. You'd have to accelerate at 1g for a year. A long burn today is measured in minutes. A long burn is measured in minutes. We're talking about a year. What is that? I'll tell you in a second here. So if we were if we had a rocket engine that was powerful enough to produce 1g of thrust, and you wanted to get to 50% of the speed of light, it's like people used to know how to do math. So you need it for 6 months. So 60 seconds times 60 equals 3,600 minutes. That's in an hour. I'm sorry. Yes. Times 24 hours times 180 days. That's a burn of 15,552,000 seconds. 15 million seconds of burn, as opposed to, some of these burns, most of these burns are 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2-3 minutes, that kind of thing. That's a lot of impulse. It's a lot of delta V. But it's theoretically possible. And obviously, the slower you go, the longer it takes, but it's theoretically possible. So to answer your question in a very long, roundabout way, Jennifer, I think it is possible to get to other solar systems. I think it's possible to get to other solar systems by achieving the most efficient drive you can, staying close, using everything you can to keep the fuel weight off of the ship. That might mean beamed power to get you started. That might mean things like, gravity assist, catapults, strap-on boosters that fall off, whatever it takes, just get you going. And then just carry enough fuel to slow you down. Ideally, you could slow down in a planet's atmosphere. There's any number of ways you could slow down. Just take the least fuel with you. So I think it's doable. But it would be doable using extremely efficient engines, some form of suspended animation, although I don't really much like that term anymore. And then patience. One final thing about space travel at interstellar travel. Clarke, as typical, Arthur C. Clarke dealt with this issue. When you're moving at those kind of speeds, 10% of the speed of light, 20%, 30% of the speed of light, 50% of the speed of light, when you're looking at those kind of speeds, if you hit a particle of dust, the kind of dust mote you see floating in the room, that'll probably take out your ship. It is the kinetic energy of your vessel is so high, And there's so much energy on it that if you hit anything, you're going to have a serious, serious problem. And when I think something like a P or a BB is the end of it, it's the end of the ship. Ship's vaporized. So what do you do about this? It's true that there's very little space. There's very little junk in interstellar space, very little dust, very little, virtually no rocks. This whole business about meteors is all nonsense. But you have to face it. If you hit a particle of dust on the way, everybody dies. Clark solved this problem in a pretty interesting way. He had a vehicle on one of his things, I forget which one it was, that had a giant ice, like frozen seawater, on the front of the ship, which was heavy and you had to move it. But it was basically, I don't know, scores of feet thick or something. This is a giant block of ice up front, and this thing took the impacts of small grains of sand or dust boats or whatever. You hit anything bigger than that, you're done. But there's not many of those things out there. Anyway, it's something that not many people talk about. Obviously, on things like Star Trek, on the Enterprise, you've got deflector shields and screens that are blowing all this stuff out of the way. But that raises the question of how do you project a force field faster than light? And you start getting into things like space warps, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Although this one's already an hour and 8 minutes, we're 2 questions in, so that's okay. It's fun. So let's get back to the solar system, because the solar system at least is something you can speculate on. By the way, this will curl your hair. If we were to say that interstellar travel is 100 years from now, let's say we can do it in 100 years. Movies are about 100 years old. If you look back to one of the first movies ever made, it's what was his name? I want to say it's Lumiere, but I don't know if that's right. Back in the very late 1800s, I want to say 1896, 97, there was a movie made called Journey to the Moon, or From the Earth to the Moon. It's a Jules Verne thing, in black and white, done with cardboard props. That movie that Scorsese made was based on that guy, Hugo. Anyway, my point is this. If you look at those guys getting in that artillery shell and then wandering around on the moon, that was 100 years ago. If you look at some of the corny stuff from the 1950s, cut the rockets, rocket 2, and you've got these oscilloscopes and they're using like mechanical relays and levers and all that other stuff. That was only 40, 50, 60 years ago. What I'm trying to say is the actual vehicle, the actual technology will probably look as different as stuff 50, 60 years in the past does. If you look at these guys like the Flash Gordon serials and how awful that stuff looked and how silly and absurd it was, and how silly and absurd some of this 50s spaceships were, our best guess is probably going to look that silly or absurd 100 years from now. It's kind of shocking, really. Although, with that said, 2001: A Space Odyssey holds up so well. Anyway, here we go. Justin White wants to know, what is the most viable, even if largely theoretical, form of propulsion for interplanetary travel? This is something else. I did an enormous amount of research here. We'll simplify things here, and I could make a whole episode about this, but we'll simplify things here. And so for those of you who understand the details of this, I understand I'm making a couple of simplifications just to get the point across. When we talk about a rocket, we're talking about a couple different things. The 2 main things we're talking about in terms of a rocket's performance are thrust and specific impulse. Thrust is how much of a push it makes. In other words, a big, powerful rocket might push 10,000 pounds of thrust. If you were standing on it in a zero-G field, you'd weigh 10,000 pounds. A smaller rocket might produce 2 pounds of thrust. So thrust is how much push, how powerful the push of the rocket engine is. And when you're trying to get something off of the Earth's surface, something like the Saturn V, which weighed over 1 million pounds, you need a lot of thrust. If you've got 1 million pounds of weight and fuel and stuff sitting on the pad, you need more than 1 million pounds of thrust to get that thing going vertically. So thrust is important when you're trying to get out of the gravity field of the Earth, which is the hardest part of the whole journey by far. So thrust is important, but thrust is not the critical thing in interstellar travel, or rather, we're talking interplanetary travel now. In interplanetary travel, it's not thrust. Thrust is not what matters, because thrust is brute force. What matters is specific impulse. Think about thrust maybe as horsepower. If you have an engine that's got 600 horsepower, is a powerful engine, can accelerate like that and get you out of here. That's nice and cool and everything. But if you're going a long, long way, thrust is not necessarily your friend. What you want to do in interplanetary travel is a third term that we're going to use, and that's delta V. Delta V is the total change in your velocity from when you start to when you stop. If I'm starting at rest or in orbit and I want to go from here to there, the more I can change my velocity, delta V is a change in velocity, the more delta V I can apply, the faster I can get there, and the more things I can do. So you would think that delta V would be measured by thrust, and delta V is measured by thrust. If you have a big, powerful rocket, you're getting a lot of delta V, but that's not the limiting factor. The limiting factor is actually specific impulse, and the best way to think of specific impulse is efficiency. If thrust is horsepower, delta V is miles per gallon. ISP is specific impulse is miles per gallon. Specific impulse basically says that an engine can produce a certain amount of thrust per pound of fuel. So an engine that produces a pound of thrust for 100 seconds is better than an engine that produces 10 pounds of thrust for 5 seconds. You get more delta V out of it. Even though the thrust is less, it burns longer. Less powerful, but for a longer time. So specific impulse is the key. It's the entire key, because specific impulse is efficiency, EMARK-P, whatever you said. It's efficiency. It's a function of efficiency. When you start talking about taking a vehicle from one place to another, you have a very specific set of problems. The structure weighs things. The people weigh a certain amount. The structure weighs a certain amount. The air weighs a certain amount. And all the stuff weighs a certain amount. You got to move that. Now, in order to move it, you have to put fuel on the vehicle, but fuel adds weight to the vehicle. In fact, fuel adds most of the weight to the vehicle. So you think, okay, load up a certain amount of fuel. Well, the problem is now you have to move not just the vehicle, but you have to move that fuel. So that takes more fuel. And if you're going to stop at the other end, you have to carry enough fuel to slow down the vehicle, and the fuel needed to accelerate it, and the fuel that you got to carry to slow it down at the other end. And this is a death spiral. Same thing happens in aviation, where, we build our airplane and we're going to make it go faster, so we put more jet engines on it. Well, bigger engines mean more fuel. Okay, so we make a bigger wing, we carry more fuel. More fuel means more drag and more weight, which means an even bigger engine. It's a death spiral. You have to go the other way. Efficiency is everything. So there's a term called mass fraction, and that is how much of the vehicle is fuel, propulsion mass, versus how much of stuff is actual payload. And it's scary numbers. So to give you some numbers now, to apply some numbers in terms of efficiency of engines, the Saturn V main engines, the F1 engines on the first stage of the Saturn V, those 5 big engines that got the Saturn V into space, produced hundreds of thousands of pounds of thrust, very high horsepower, not terribly efficient. Those engines had a specific impulse of about 250 seconds. The Space Shuttle main engines, a generation later, were significantly more efficient. Space Shuttle main engines, the 3 engines on the back of the Space Shuttle, not the solid rocket boosters. The Space Shuttle main engines got a specific impulse of about 450, which is nearly double and better. But the Space Shuttle main engines are very near the theoretical limits of chemical reactions. Rocket engines like the Saturn V main engine and the Space Shuttle main engine work by basically taking something that burns, like alcohol or liquid hydrogen or any number of other things, and combining it with oxygen to make it burn, to make a chemical reaction that's exactly like the kind of thing that happens when you pour lighter fluid on charcoal. So there's only so much energy you can pack into chemicals, into a chemical reaction. Chemical reactions can only be so energetic, and I think hydrogen is the best fuel. If you take hydrogen and you, the most efficient fuel, I should say, and you have to add oxygen, liquid oxygen is extremely energetic. If you've ever seen, I think it's a couple of these on YouTube, you pour liquid oxygen onto a charcoal fire and you will have a memorable event, because the burning of fire in our atmosphere is not limited by the fuel, it's limited by the oxygen. You pump compressed air onto a fire and the fire burns much harder. You put liquid oxygen onto a fire and the fire goes crazy, because it's the oxygen content that's limiting the energy. To say all this is just to say that right now we are not at the engineering limit, although we're pretty much at the theoretical limit to how much energy you can get out of chemical rockets, and it's about 450 miles per gallon. Okay, that's a gross misunderstanding, but it's the best term we can use that most of us understand. So 250 miles per gallon for the shuttle engines, 450 miles per gallon for the, 250 for the Saturn V and 450 for the Space Shuttle main engines. Now, what do you do if you want to go past that, if you want to be more efficient than that? What you ultimately, what it all comes down to is this. Inside the combustion chamber of that rocket engine, how hot can we make things? It's really just that simple. The hotter you can make things, the more energetic that push is, because a rocket engine functions by pushing against the front of the chamber, but there's nothing to push on against the back, so all of the push goes forward. The exhaust is just the exhaust. It's actually the push comes from the inside of the exhaust. It comes from inside of the chamber. The more energetic you make that reaction, the more efficient your rocket engine is going to be. You build a bigger one, you get more thrust, but the more efficient it's going to be. So, what can you do to make something hotter than take a chemical and burn it? Is there anything you can do to make something hotter than that? As it turns out, there are many things you can do to make something hotter than that. One of the key story arcs in Aurora, and I think my favorite part of Aurora emotionally is, at the very beginning of that movie, these guys are in a bunker, and they've got their engineering crews and their flight crews. They're doing the final test of an engine design that is a feasible design. Plenty of working designs for it. I don't think anyone's ever actually built one yet, called a gas core nuclear rocket engine. And a gas core nuclear rocket engine, I'll come to in a minute. But in the first 3 minutes of my movie, this gas core nuclear rocket engine, which is extremely efficient, I said 250 for the Saturn V, 450 for the shuttle main engines. This thing was getting 3,000 seconds of specific impulse, which is more than enough to get you there. And this thing explodes. And it takes out the whole engineering crew, takes out the flight crew, destroys the entire facility, puts them in enormous political trouble, and leaves the survivors with a ship but no engine. And if they don't get some kind of mission going, they're probably going to go to jail. So, what do? Well, as it turns out, in the movie, they find a scientist who worked on an actual program called NERVA. NERVA was a nuclear rocket engine program that NASA started in the late 60s, went from about 68 to 70, 71, 72, somewhere in there. And they find a guy who was a 22-year-old engineer who's now in his 80s or 90s. And this engine, the NERVA engines were probably pushing 800, 750, 800. That's double, damn near double, the efficiency of the Space Shuttle main engine. How do they work? Well, what they were building in NERVA was called a solid core nuclear rocket engine, which may be the simplest machine ever built. It essentially has no moving parts. There's a pump. That's about it. And all this thing does is very simple. You take a bunch of enriched uranium, not weapons-grade uranium, but enriched uranium, as in a power plant. When you put enough uranium in one place, it gets very, very hot because there's nuclear reactions going on. As it turns out, it gets hotter than a chemical reaction could ever get. And then basically you take liquid hydrogen, you run the liquid hydrogen around the engine to keep it cool, because liquid hydrogen has to be hundreds of degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And then you squirt this liquid hydrogen over this really hot reactor. And when that liquid hydrogen hits that reactor, it cools the reactor, which is good, but it expands so rapidly that it is doing the same thing as burning chemicals do. It's a gas expansion inside the rocket chamber, and it is twice as hot as the hottest chemical reaction. So even the rockets that they built in the 70s have an ISP of about 700 and 750. Now, in my movie, we have a guy who was a rocket engineer for NERVA in the 20s, and he spent the last 60, 70 years working on advanced ceramics. We made some improvements in ceramics. The problem with a solid core nuclear rocket is you could probably get it even hotter than that. But once the temperature of that reaction gets to be 400, 500, 600 degrees centigrade, the engine starts to melt, because metal will melt. You can only do so much to protect it. Now, in my movie, this guy's had 30, 40, 50, 60 years to work on his own ceramic mix, and we've done some good work with ceramics. The shuttle tiles are terrific ceramics. So if you could coat the inside of this metal engine with a ceramic base, because ceramics, like pottery, can take more heat than metals, then you could probably get the thing hot enough so that when I write my story, they launch this thing, they're hoping for 800 seconds of specific impulse. And in the movie, he gets them up to 880, which is more than they needed. And that's enough to get you around. That gets you a 2-year mission, 2 to 3 year mission to Jupiter and back. So a solid core nuclear rocket engine is just a uranium pile with holes in it, and you push liquid hydrogen through it, and you get an energetic reaction, and you get about twice the miles per gallon. Again, that's an extremely purgative term, but it's just the simplest thing you got. You get twice the specific impulse out of a simple solid core nuclear reactor, nuclear rocket, than you get out of the most efficient chemical engines, the space shuttle main engines. Something else happens that's nice if you have an engine like that, and that is that basically what you've got is you've got a nuclear reactor. You've got like 3 Mile Island or any other of the nuclear reactors around the world. You've got a hot cluster of uranium that is exchanging neutrons and is having a nuclear reaction which gets very hot. The reason a ground-based power plant works, or a power plant in a submarine works, is this uranium core gets very hot. If you put a liquid over that hot thing, the liquid gets hot. The liquid expands, goes through a turbine. That turbine generates electricity. Here we are. So the nice thing about a solid core nuclear reactor, nuclear rocket is you can set it up very simply to be something called a bimodal solid core nuclear rocket. That's what Aurora uses. It's essentially a nuclear reactor in space that generates masses of electricity, all the electricity you could ever want to use, which is nice. And then they pump liquid hydrogen over it when they want to make it into a rocket engine, and that liquid hydrogen expands and comes out the back end, and off you go. Now, on Aurora, the thrust is actually pretty low. During the normal burns in this thing, the thrust is probably, 20% of a G, 0.2 G, 0.15 G. So it's a weak push, but it can go for a long time. And as I said, it's the efficiency that matters. They'll crank it up at the end in the big action-based adventure ending of the thing, because ultimately I'm making an action movie, not a documentary. So that's a solid core nuclear reactor. But the solid core nuclear reactor, all these things are limited by temperature. How hot can you make something? Well, as it turns out, the reason you can't make a solid core nuclear reactor any hotter than that and get any more efficiency than that is because it'll melt. It just starts to melt. No matter what you do to protect it, eventually it starts to melt. Now, there's a way to prevent this. And this is what they're trying to do with nuclear fusion, because while there is no structure, metal or otherwise, that can take temperatures of thousands of degrees over time, what you can do is you can put that reaction inside a magnetic field. And if you keep it inside a magnetic field, the magnetic field can contain that reaction and keep it away from the physical structure enough so that you can keep that structure intact. Now you start to get into something really interesting. There's an intermediate step after the solid core nuclear reactor. There's a nuclear rocket. There's something called a pebble bed reactor, where you're using, I'm not even going to get into that. It's just a way to keep things a little bit cooler. But gas core is really cool. What a gas core nuclear rocket does, which is the experimental rocket that fails at the beginning of my movie, is it does the exact same thing. It doesn't, by the way, in the solid core nuclear rocket, in the Nerva rockets, in Aurora, the stuff that we're carrying is not, technically speaking, fuel. The fuel is the actual uranium. It's propellant mass. It's just something to shoot out the end of the rocket. It doesn't matter what. It could be chalk. It could be, some people have talked about powdered diamonds as having a tremendous density, whatever. Whatever you want. You got to put something in there to expand and push. But the fuel tanks on the Aurora, technically speaking, and I got it in the script, is not fuel. It's reaction mass. It's something squirted out the back end. So the actual fuel is the uranium core. But in a gas core rocket, what happens is this. Instead of you having a metal structure with rods in it like a traditional nuclear reactor, what you do is you have a magnetic field in a torus. And into that magnetic torus, you inject uranium hexafluoride gas. I think it's uranium hexafluoride. You're basically uranium gas. And you pump that gas into that torus. And as you add more and more of that gas into a smaller and smaller space, that uranium gas does the same thing that it does in a solid rod. After enough of it gets close enough together, it reaches critical mass and it starts to have a nuclear fission reaction. And because it's not in a physical structure, but rather in a magnetic field, you can get it much, much hotter. So now if you could contain that reaction inside that magnetic torus, you could then inject that same liquid hydrogen into there, but instead of temperatures being hundreds of degrees, they would be thousands of degrees. And that means that expansion, the reaction, is far more energetic. And so instead of 250 for the Apollo rocket, 450 for the shuttle main engines, 800 for a solid core Nerva rocket from the 1970s, you probably get to 2,000, 3,000 seconds of specific impulse. And when you get to those kind of numbers, the solar system becomes available. You can do it on nuclear rockets. I don't think you can get there on chemical rockets. So the best way to think about this is pretty simple. Given the technology of the Apollo program, you would not be able to get around the solar system in reasonable amounts of time. Obviously, we can get to the solar system using Estes model rocket engines because these probes, some of these probes have so little delta V, it's unbelievable. That's why they have to use gravity assist. You can get to Jupiter, but you can't get to Jupiter in less than 7 years, 8 years. That's not a mission. In order to have a mission that's survivable and doable for any number of other reasons, chemical rockets probably won't get you there. You have to carry so much fuel and then more fuel to move the fuel that you just can't get there. When you get to a solid core nuclear rocket, you can. When you get to a gas core nuclear rocket, you can get there in a matter of weeks instead of months. So let's get on it. This stuff can be built tomorrow. Not only can the gas core nuclear rocket be built tomorrow, the solid core nuclear rocket, the NERVA rockets, were not only built tomorrow, they were built 40 years ago. NERVA built 22 of them, and every one of them worked just great. They worked great. And in Aurora, they find, as it turns out, historically, history was kind to me here. I think they built 22 and they fired up 21 of them, but one of them they didn't fire. They never actually activated the core, which means it never got radioactive. Now, in my world, it's still sitting under a tarp out in Jackass Flats, Nevada. But I'm sure in the real world it isn't. But nevertheless, they built them and they worked. So we could go. All we need is the will to go. We'll get to that in a minute. I get the feeling this is going to be a two-parter. And that actually suits me because it gives me a chance to get the... In fact, let's just make that decision right now. We'll make this a two-parter because I love talking about this stuff. We've got a bunch of things to get to. So we'll come back for Space Episode Part 2 next time because we're still on question 3. So there's that. Now, there's other things called Vasimir, which is a variable plasma core thing where you can change... The Vasimir is interesting because what the Vasimir does is it allows you to manipulate the internals of the engine. So if you want a lot of thrust, like a lot of push, at a cost of efficiency, you can do that, and then you can kind of tweak it down and less push for a longer time, more efficiency, and so on. The final thing I'll mention, because it's the only other real viable thing that's actually buildable in the next 50 years, is ion propulsion. People talk a lot about ion drives. Ion is fantastic in one way. An ion rocket, we talked about ISPs of 200, 450, 800 being good, 3,000 being insane. Great. Ion rockets have ISPs in the tens of thousands, 30,000s. A tremendously efficient rocket. The problem is that the ion rocket is so efficient because its thrust is unbelievably small. Ion rockets, some of these ion rockets that are out there now, we've got a couple ion rockets pushing probes around the solar system right now. Some of them, as I understand it, produce less thrust than the weight of a piece of paper. In other words, the weight of this one piece of paper pushing down on my hand is about as hard as that ion rocket is pushing. Ion rockets are pretty simple. As with any other, the definition of a rocket is something that shoots something out one end, and the Newton's law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if you push 10 pounds out one way, the thing wants to go 10 pounds the other way. What an ion rocket does is instead of pushing out hot gas, it's pushing out electrons. An ion rocket takes a metal like cesium that has a lot of free electrons, uses electricity to split the electrons off, or the ions off, and then using magnets, it accelerates those particles out the back end. And because it does this very, very efficiently, it has a very high efficiency, but the problem is you're only talking about pumping out little molecules, so it's not a lot of push. Right now, the problem with ion propulsion is, and for the foreseeable future, I haven't heard that anybody's got a plan to fix this. They're kind of theoretically limited to being very, very efficient, but very, very low thrust. Very, very, very low thrust. Unusably low thrust, in my opinion. It's not a problem if you have a space probe, right? As I said, we've got at least one space probe out there. I forget what the name of it is. It might be Stardust. I'm not sure. But basically, if you've got a probe, and you've got a probe that's at a comet, you want to go visit another comet, okay. So what if it's only pushing as hard as a piece of paper? They never turn it off. It just runs. And so over the course of 3 years or 4 years, it's given you enough delta V to get from one place to some other place that's not too far away. And then, 3 years or 8 years later, it goes someplace else over time. But that's not what we're talking about. It's not really effective. And that was heartbreaking for me because when I was a kid and started researching this in independent study when I was 12 or something, I remember thinking, ion rockets are going to be cool. And they are cool. They're just useless, essentially. We may be able to do something about that, but I don't see it on the horizon. So those are your basic flavors right now, Justin. And if it were me, I'd put 70% of my available resources into perfecting the solid core bimodal nuclear rocket engines that we first built in the 1970s. We know they work. We built 20 of them. They work great. I would put 70% of my total propulsion budget, if I had a research budget, into perfecting those. And by perfecting them, I mean you make the design more efficient, you make build the structure a little better, because you just want to make it take as much heat as you can. A fair amount of that money I'd put into ceramic work, so that if you coat the inside of the metal with a good ceramic, you might be able to protect the metal to get the internal temperature higher. The higher the internal temperature gets, the better the efficiency. The less fuel it takes to move a pound of payload, because it's taking that pound of fuel and doing a more energetic reaction with it. That's the definition of specific impulse. So I'd spend most of my money on perfecting something that we know works. Not only do you get a rocket engine, you get all the power you could ever use. You're taking a nuclear reactor with you, the same kind of thing that drives submarines through the ocean using electric power. You got enough energy there to take water and disassociate the water. You find water on a comet. You melt the water. You pump it into a chamber. You pass electricity through it. You take the oxygen out of the water, H2O, right? Take the oxygen out, use it for the crew. You take the hydrogen and you put it in the tank and you use that as a propellant mass. You're good to go. You got the solar system if you have a decent solid core nuclear rocket. And then I take about 20 or 30% of my propulsion budget, and I'd spend it on a gas core nuclear rocket. I'm not talking about fusion. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about a magnetic bottle that is at least better than a ceramic lined metal bottle. Because all I want to do is find a place where I can make things very, very hot. And you're good to go. So it's not impossible. It's not only not impossible, we did it 40 years ago. We did it, and then we got bored with it, and we shut it down, and it's out there at Jackass Flats, Nevada, at a place called NERDS. You want to talk about the perfect acronym? NERDS, the Nuclear Energy Rocket Development something or other. I think that's right. Somebody's going to tell me in a minute, because that's a great thing about the hive mind. Anyway, that's it, Justin. That's what we got. And by the way, that's good enough. The hotter we can get something without melting it, we pour liquid hydrogen over that, and the hotter we can get it, the faster we can get from one place to another, because we can burn longer going one way and we can burn longer going the other way for the same amount of fuel. Reaction mass, rather. All right, moving on. Oh, look, it's a question from Zachariah Tiemans. Do you prefer the aerial-based aesthetic of Star Wars ships, which really is Star Wars fighters and things, or the naval-based aesthetic of Star Trek ships? Which is more compelling and which is more realistic? Well, obviously, the Star Trek version of ships is more realistic than fighter planes, but that doesn't mean it's realistic. So let's walk through these two. We'll walk through the Star Wars model, we'll walk through the Star Trek model, and then we'll walk into reality. Star Wars is not science fiction. I like Star Wars okay. I mean, I had a good time at Star Wars, but Star Wars didn't get into my DNA the way that Star Trek did. And that's a generational thing, I guess. So when I watch the first Star Wars and I see the X-Wing fighters rolling in and they're banking in space and they're pulling out of dives and doing all this other stuff, I understand what it is. It's fantasy. It's cartoon. He built that sequence on, fighter attacks on American bombers. He literally looked at all this gun camera footage from World War II, saw these fighters peeling off, said, that's kind of cool, poo-poo, choo-choo-choo, poo-poo-poo, and then, pull out, bail out, look up, boom, crash, down it goes, plane gets hit, X-Wing fighter gets hit, and its engine explodes, and then it just descends into the Death Star, which has a gravity field of essentially zero. It's utter fantasy. It's utter, complete fantasy, period. I'm a pilot. I like flying airplanes and I like fighter pilots. I just think it's silly, personally. It's fun to play, but it's silly. Wing Commander's fun, but it's silly. Now, when you get into Star Trek and you start thinking of ships, big space vehicles as ships, you're somewhat better, but you're damn near actually, believe it or not, Zechariah, you're almost as bad, for a number of reasons. Now, with the Enterprise, you've got a couple things that make the Enterprise look like a naval vessel, and these are magical workarounds because you want it to look like a naval vessel. You want it to look like a ship, and it turns. It doesn't. When the Enterprise turns, it might list a little bit and kind of lean into the turn, but it doesn't bank into the turn. It doesn't do a 90-degree turn, and everything's on the same plane. By the way, right? The vehicles are all on the same plane. It's like the solar system is flat, and here's the Enterprise, and the top of the Enterprise is up, and here comes the Klingon ship, and the top of it is up, and they're both on a level C in space, and so that's why it feels like a naval battle. As I said on my Star Trek Afterburner, which is the favorite thing I ever did. It's not my best work, but it's my favorite work. Roddenberry was influenced. He said he wanted to make a Western in space. He said he wanted to make wagon train in space, but what he really was making was Horatio Hornblower movies. He loved Horatio Hornblower, and he loved the idea that the captain that Captain Horatio Hornblower, as a young man commanding a ship of the Royal Navy on the other side of the world, was not just the Royal Navy. He was England. He had to make decisions for the Empire. He didn't get on the subspace radio or call Chief of Naval Operations and say, I've run into a French frigate, what do I do? The thing that fascinated Roddenberry about Hornblower was that Captain Horatio Hornblower was England, and he was empowered by the Royal Navy and the Queen to represent England, and if he was going to start a war, it would be on his shoulders. That's fascinating to me and to Roddenberry, and that's what he wanted Kirk to be. He wanted Kirk to be America. He wanted Federation to be America. He wanted Kirk to be an American who had to make decisions based on his value set, and he didn't get to ask permission. That's what Star Trek was. But anyway, in order to get that naval feel, where up is up, and the ships are on the same flat plane, and nobody's, Klingons are coming one way, the Enterprise is coming the other way. Nobody's coming down, and nobody's coming down at an angle. In Wrath of Khan, they barely scratch the surface of three-dimensional things. His tactics represent a certain limited three-dimensional thinking or lack of three-dimensional thinking, so they move in the Z-coordinate for the first time in the history of spaceflight. The big tactical win in Wrath of Khan, which I loved. It's one of my favorite movies ever, don't get me wrong. It's one of my favorite. It may have been the best movie experience I ever had, watching Wrath of Khan in a theater. But, at the end of this, it's like, what are we going to do to defeat this mad genius, Khan? We could move in 3 dimensions in space. That might fool him. Yeah, let's try that. So, you've got Star Trek, which feels more realistic than Star Wars, but Star Trek is not realistic at all. First of all, we have to understand that, much as it's painful to admit it, Star Wars is utter fantasy. Star Trek is science fiction because they go to the trouble to explain how this could work, but just because they're explaining how something could work doesn't mean that's how it will work. What he wanted was something that looked like a naval vessel. So what does that mean? It means that you've got a warp drive, which means there is no reaction mass. A thing can accelerate and slow down. It doesn't have to turn around to slow down. Every rocket in the world, if you want to slow down, you just have to turn it around and point the rocket in the other direction. The Enterprise never does that. It just slows down, like a ship. Like there's drag. And you have to have artificial gravity. So you've got these horizontal decks, and this is the key thing about why Star Trek is not terribly realistic compared to what we know about spaceflight. This is the simplest thing, but it's also one of the most important things. Think about the Enterprise in cross-section. Hold that thought. Don't go away. Somebody do a tap dance. Let's not even get into why I have one of these things. Okay, so here's the Enterprise, right? I'll make it look, yeah. Okay, so here's the Enterprise. And here's what's key about why Star Trek is not realistic in terms of what we know to be the truth today. As I said, first of all, there's no rocket acceleration. The thing uses a drive. It's essentially a reactionless thing. So it goes forward and then it slows down. When the Enterprise is going this way, it doesn't turn around and go backwards, blasting its rocket engine to slow down. But the main thing that makes Star Trek unrealistic is this, compared to what the real world will be for the foreseeable future. Here's the Enterprise, and the Enterprise moves that way. The Enterprise goes through space like that, right? But gravity on the Enterprise is doing that. Gravity is going down. So there's a deck, and everybody's walking with their feet that way so that the gravity field is perpendicular to the direction of travel, right? It's just that simple. Enterprise is moving sideways, but gravity is going down. Because that's what we have come to know. That's what's familiar to audiences who don't have a big background in spaceflight. There are certain things about actual spaceflight that are absolutely counterintuitive. But that doesn't mean that people won't understand them. It just means that no one's done the work to educate the audience in it. So, the main reason that Star Trek is still extremely unrealistic is for that reason. When you are accelerating under rocket power, the force is downward. So the way to think about a rocket is to think of it as a skyscraper. That's the way to think about what a rocket would look like. Think of the Empire State Building horizontal. Because whenever that rocket is firing, there is no gravity in space. You're not pulled in any one direction or another. So if you've got a rocket in space, here's my rocket. We used to do this when we were children. Here's a rocket in space, right? And here's the end where the stuff comes out. So the thing fires and it starts moving this way. Well, because it's moving this way and you're not doing anything, you're just hanging out in space weightless. As the rocket moves that way, it pushes you. You're standing on a bulkhead. It pushes you so that as this rocket burns, down isn't that way. Down is that way. That's down. So it's actually a skyscraper, top floor all the way down to the bottom floor. Gravity is down, but since it's under acceleration, that's cool. But if it's under acceleration, that's the same thing. That's basically what I'm trying to say. What I'm basically trying to say is that rockets produce thrust, and when the rocket engine is firing, there is a pseudo-gravity that is as good as real gravity. It's as good as centrifugal gravity. And that gravity vector is pointing towards the engine. That's the best way to think of it. Your feet are going to be pointing towards the engine, and your head is going to be pointing away from the engine. And as long as that rocket is firing, you have a gravity field. And somebody just pointed out something, Bill Thompson. I don't know if he was talking about the model. I'm assuming he is. You know why you go to all this trouble to have artificial gravity and inertial dampers and all the other stuff? The reason is pretty simple. The reason is because this is gorgeous. This is just gorgeous. It is Enterprise A, is the best looking thing ever designed. I mean, if I could have anything in the entire wish list of the world, the Jupiter 2 would be nice to, dick around in. But this is the best looking thing of all time. It's just fabulous. It's incredible. Much better than the original series and infinitely better than that big-headed, weak-haunched, appalling Enterprise D on Next Generation. You can fight it out among yourselves. Anyway, when we talk about realism in motion in space, Zechariah, neither Star Wars, which is just plain absurd, or Star Trek, which is a naval translation into space, is realistic. It's going to look like something that no one's ever seen before. And what's going to blow people's minds, I think, in Aurora is something that's just so straightforward to actual rocket scientists, but you never, ever, 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 ever see it. When you are trying to slow down, you may be moving at a clip like that. You're going that way very fast, but the engine is facing forward. The ship is traveling backwards, and the engine is firing. In other words, the flame is coming out of the engine, but you're going that way. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but it obviously does make perfect sense. If you're moving forward at 1,000 meters per second, and you start to slow down, you've got to push in the opposite direction. So when you get to these guys decelerating in order to get into a Jupiter insertion burn or something, or even a comet insertion burn, you're going to see the ship moving in one direction, but the engine is going to be at the front instead of at the back, and the engine is going to be firing, and it's going to say to everybody, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. It should be going the other way. Well, it's trying to go the other way. That's why it's doing it. It's slowing down. And I don't care if people don't get it. I think they are going to get it. We had this discussion before on the Stratosphere Lounge where we talked about Crimson Tide and how you don't have to have the truth there. And people may not miss it if it's not there, but if it is there, they'll know it. So that's basically the difference. Think of a ship more as a skyscraper. The decks will not be longitudinally arranged; they'll be vertically arranged. There's no reason not to, unless you have magical technology, in which case, fine, rock on. But even if you have magical technology, there's still no reason to do it. Why would you do it? Why would you go to all the trouble to make everything perpendicular to what you're going to be doing most of the time anyway? It's laziness is what it is. It's laziness. And that's why the real future is going to make our attempts to guess the future look as bad as watching Flash Gordon try to explain this whole thing. You can get to something that approximates the truth. You just got to be willing to drop your preconceptions of what you think would look cool and go with what's actually real. So these are things that are they have their own beauty. And I'll elaborate on this because I think we'll open up the next one. We're going to make this a two-parter. Maybe we'll talk more about space combat in the next one, because space combat I can do 3 hours on just on that. But just as one more example, not in the first movie, but in the second movie, the sequel to Aurora, there is in fact a situation where we go to war with China in space. And I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about this too. And this is hundreds of things to talk about there, but this is the simplest one. We are so used to seeing the Enterprise fire phasers and seeing the beams come out of this thing, even if we couldn't actually see it, because we're seeing them leave like they're high-speed things, you know. But even forgetting the speed at which they travel, you cannot see a beam of energy in space. You can't see a beam of energy in a room. If you were in a dark room and the room was filtered so that there was nothing in it, if the air was absolutely pure, I could put the world's most powerful spotlight directly 2 inches in front of your nose, going perpendicular to your vision, and you would never know it was there. You'd have no way of knowing it was there. The reason that you can see beams like a flashlight beam on Earth at nighttime, or laser beams here on Earth, is because you're not seeing the beam. You're not seeing the light beam. What you're seeing is dust particles being illuminated by the beam. So the beam is invisible. Light is invisible. You can't actually see light. Light, as I said, the most powerful beam of light can go right in front of your eyes, perpendicular to your eyes. You never know it was there. All you can see is when the energy from a light beam strikes matter, it reflects, and then you can see that. You can see the matter being reflected. So laser beams look cool on Earth because they're so narrow and so tight. But as a guy who ran laser shows in planetariums and nightclubs for 10 years, I can tell you virtually most all of the work I did that wasn't during the show was work cleaning and maintaining those damn smoke machines. Those things are horrible. They smell bad, the smoke juice is awful, and they clog easily, and they don't last very long. You really got to stay on top of them. A smoke machine is just a heater, basically. It's just a heating element that you pour a liquid onto, and when the liquid hits this heating element, it makes smoke. Why do we need so many smoke machines for a laser show? Because if you don't have a lot of smoke in that room, you won't see the beams. And the smokier the room is, the better the beams look. So now, in a nightclub, my job, in order to make the lasers really pop and make them look great, there's enough dust in any given room so that you could see beams at nighttime faintly in a room with no smoke in it. But my job was to put this mist, this smoke, into the room, and the more smoke I put into the room, the more particles I suspended in the air, the more that beam reflected those particles, and the more those beams popped. They really just lit up. It's spectacular. It was great. Especially when you went straight to the krypton-argon blue-white beam and didn't peel off the individual colors. When you went to the undifferentiated beam, that thing was killer. You could almost hear it. That's another thing. So in space combat, in movie 2, the Chinese are going to have a laser weapon, and when this thing fires, you're not going to see anything. And that presents a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous problem for me as a writer and director and as a businessman. And this is why, by the way, I've sat on these ideas for 30, 40 years, because I have to make them myself. Because if I don't make them myself, other people will screw them up. I promise you they will. They will not be able to resist it. If you showed people the Chinese firing this laser weapon and nothing visibly happens, there's not a studio in the world that would release that movie. They'd throw you out. They would throw you off the movie. They'd overrule you. So you have to own it. You have to own it, both ends of it, front end and back end. Now, with that said, this is the uber point in terms of science fiction for me personally. Yes, it's true. You fire a laser beam in space and you can't see the beam. That's not for speculation. It's not up for discussion. It's just true. You can't see a beam in space. So if you have a laser weapon in space, first of all, it may not even be in the visible spectrum. It may be a microwave or ultraviolet laser, but let's just say it's a visible beam, that the light is in something that the eye can see. You fire this thing off, you don't see any beam. And you sure as heck don't hear you don't hear or see anything. So, isn't that boring? Isn't that boring? Doesn't that just cheat the audience? It actually doesn't cheat the audience. It actually doesn't. It can be done in such a way as to completely engage the audience. You just have to not be lazy. So if you fire a beam weapon in a movie and you want to make it dramatic, how do you do it if the beam's not visible? Well, turns out there's a bunch of cool things you can do. Remember I told you how what we would do in a laser show in a nightclub or in a planetarium, in order to make the beams visible, we would put smoke out there. And we put smoke out there because what happens with smoke is the beam hits the particles of smoke and those particles reflect it back. So that's why we can see the beam. But that does something else that's kind of interesting. It weakens the beam. In other words, a laser beam going from here to a spot a mile away will deliver a certain amount of energy in a clear atmosphere. The atmosphere itself is really slowing that beam down. It's much better in space. But if it's a very foggy night, that beam won't get there a mile away because the particles of fog are lighting up and it's spectacular to look at, but every time the energy of that beam hits a particle of fog and is deflected back to our eyes, it's pulling energy out of the beam. So what that means is that when you're having a space battle and you're fighting an enemy that has a laser weapon, an excellent way to defend against that laser weapon is to make space smoky, is to put something out there that's going to cause that beam to be diffused by it. In Traveler, the sci-fi role-playing game that meant so much to me, they were called sandcasters. And basically, in Traveler, all they were little canisters of sand. And you know that your enemy ship is out there, and you know they've got a laser weapon, and you know they're going to use their laser weapon against you. So you take this little canister of sand, like a depth charge, let's say, and you shoot it off in that direction. It goes a couple 100 yards out there, poof, explodes. Now what you've got is you've got a tiny little cloud of sand and dust and dirt, and that beam has to punch through that. And as the beam comes through those particles, it shows up, it becomes visible, but it also weakens it. And sand might be good. Glitter would probably be even better because glitter is highly reflective, and glitter would diverse the beam even more. Chaff, anything, rice, marbles, flour, anything. If you put particles between you and the beam, those particles will pull the energy out of the beam. The beam will heat those particles up, and those particles will burn, and it'll take the energy out of the beam. And then, in the real world, what you have then is a visible laser beam at the destination, not at the launcher, but at the destination, because it's not a vacuum anymore. It's not. It may still be a vacuum, but it's not Now there's something to reflect the beam, and we put it there on purpose. So isn't that much more interesting? If you have an initial attack, the first burst, let's say, and you think you're out of range, but they light it up on you, and all of a sudden the surface of your hull just starts to blister and glisten because this beam has hit you. You don't even know it. Jesus, what happened? Okay, so we thought we were out of range. My God, let's get some defenses out there. Blow some sand or whatever you want to call it, and then you send out a little canister out there, and it expands. You don't want to blow up too much. You want to keep it kind of dense. And another beam comes through. Now all of a sudden there is a beam. There's this bright red beam or whatever, and instead of it just like coming in space, it's actually frying this stuff and vaporizing it. There's this incredible energy reaction, and then the part that hits the hull is attenuated. Great, fantastic. Now the problem is, if you're moving, you're leaving your cloud behind you. So you got to keep popping these things. That gets to be really cool. And moving is another set of problems. But this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. We'll do a space war thing in part 2. We'll talk about weapons in space and space combat, because there's a lot of stuff in space combat that raises a lot of heckles, and I'm a real fanatic about part of this thing in terms of what it would actually look like. But you can see that by having a writer who understands the realities of the physics, what looks to be less interesting, we can't see these golden beams coming out of the phaser display, is actually much more interesting. And it's much scarier too, because you can be inside the ship and suddenly there's just a hole just appears. Just appears. I was going to say it would depressurize the ship, but if you're going to get in a spaceship fight, you want to depressurize your ship in advance anyway. It's interesting and it's different, and people understand it. And the other thing finally, I will save it for the space combat show because I don't want to get into that. We'll get into it later. But it's a great example of knowing the physics and knowing the reality and force-feeding it to an audience and making them get it, because they will. And then you've done something that is, in fact, the most important thing you can do in any kind of drama, period. And that is show people something new. That's interesting. That's not, because Star Wars was great and Star Wars is Star Wars, but how many times have they ripped that off? How many times have you seen it? How many times have you seen these, here comes a spaceship, it's the size of a city block, they're fighting, how far, what's the effective range of a phaser on the Enterprise? Is it 200 yards? You know? I mean, are they a quarter mile away when they open fire? No. When you open fire in space, you will not see the target. You won't be able to see it. You won't be able to, you might see a spot, but you won't be able to resolve it unless you get in really close. There's another things here. Anyway, so much of that. Let's do, where are we? Or 2 hours, we'll do 2 more. And then we'll get to the rest. Because, yeah, space militarization will be next, and we'll pick it up there. So we'll do 2 more tonight, and then we'll do part 2 next week or the week after. But we'll do part 2 from the new building. Jason Rasmussen asks, why space? What is a good argument to sell space to today's society? Up until a couple years ago, not even that, maybe even about a year ago, I was kind of filled with despair on this issue. Because, you know, space is not an easy sell. It used to be, but what they were selling wasn't space. And this is something I'm very clear about with the Free Frontier, which we'll talk about in part 2. The Apollo program wasn't selling space to people. You're selling pride to people. Now, in the 50s and 60s, you were, in fact, selling space. You were selling space because it was an exciting and new environment. It was a frontier. And that's why if you look at like a lot of these 50s rocket to the moon kind of thing, and, moon is our harsh mistress, these kind of things. If you look at kind of 50s, 60s sci-fi, the thing that's actually kind of charming about it once you get past how silly it is the lingo. It literally, truly is. Hand me get me the space wrench. We've got, put it on the space visor. We've got, how many space rations do we have? Jump in Jupiter, great galaxies. It's just fascination with the environment. It's really awful, 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 awful dialogue, but it's kind of charming in its own way. The space this, the space that, the space this, the space that, best summed up, by the way, in one of my favorite, probably my favorite piece of animation, which is Space Madness. Ren and Stimpy episode. Space madness. So yeah, space. But the Apollo program was about pride. It was about achievement and pride. It was about the flag, is what the NASA glory days were about. It was about the flag. It wasn't about the environment. It was about the flag. It was about seeing the flag on the moon. It was about seeing guys in Gemini rendezvousing and going places we hadn't gone before. I guess to some degree the purists thought the moon was cool, but the moon is kind of boring. Not that I wouldn't want to go, but if you really are just a regular average Joe, if you look out at Yosemite or something, it's like, holy cow, incredible stuff and birds and trees, and look, there's a bear, here's rivers, there's fish in the rivers, and there's, I can hear buzzing of insects, and the sky is blue, but not all the time. At nighttime it's different, and then the moon comes up, and but the moon is gray powder and a black sky. That's pretty much it. So it's not even the environment. The Apollo program was about pride. And I had thought, now that we'd done that, that there's not much to sell about space. As I said earlier at the beginning, even our imagination of what space looks like is not true. Space is not filled with nebulae and these incredible colorful clouds of gas and dust that you can see if you just get out of the atmosphere, if you just get closer to it. No, it's just gray. It's just a gray smudge. The other thing I'll say before I get to the answer, because I do have a positive answer about this, Jason. I'm a guy who spent 40 years still trying to get into space and thought the whole idea of space colonization and stuff was awesome. If you'd asked me when I was 20, 25, 30 even, 40 even, probably even 50 almost. This is how recent it is. Would I be willing to go and live on Mars or on the moon forever? Would I be willing to go on a 20-year tour of the solar system? I would have said, yes, of course. Even if you don't come back? Even if you have to live in space forever? Absolutely. Live in space? You kidding? Living in space is what I was built for, baby. I'll live in space for the rest of my life. Sign me up. Get me out there. Most people who are space freaks feel that way. But as I get older, I realize that I definitely want to travel in space, but I do not want to live in space. And nobody does. Nobody does. Remember earlier we were talking about, I think it's the only episode where I've said remember. I've said it twice now. Of course you remember, you smart people. We were talking a while ago about specific impulse and mass fraction. And that means that the lighter you can make things, the easier it is to get there. The less fuel or reaction mass you have to carry. So keep the weight down. The way you keep the weight down is make things small. So here's an aesthetic that's built into Aurora. And this is how you're going to know that you got a real kind of a realistic feel. When I talk to people, people said, do you have any idea about the art design for the inside of the ship? I said, I do. What does the inside of the ship feel like? Not just look like. What does it feel like? The inside of the Aurora feels like a restroom on an airliner. That's what it feels like. And you'll know you've got it right if you capture the sense of being in an airliner restroom, lavatory, I guess, inside the lavatory. Now you know you're talking. If you get the sense that the kitchen feels like the galley in the back of a 737, and that the quarters and certainly the bathroom and everything else feels like an airline lavatory, you're there. You cannot afford to bring big structures with you. These giant, huge structures, you just can't. You can put them into orbit because you've got a big, heavy rocket. You don't have to go very far. You're not talking about efficiency. You got a Saturn V to put Skylab up there, and 100 shuttle launches to get those things up there. But you're talking about going someplace and slowing down, getting back. You have to keep it light, which means carbon fiber, and you have to keep it small because air weighs stuff. The bigger the volume, the more the air weighs. Well, you say, well, what difference does it make? Well, air weighs stuff. Air has weight to it, and the more air you have, the more fuel you need to push that air, and then the more fuel you need to slow that air down at the other end, and the more fuel you need to carry and push the fuel that's going to slow it down, and the more fuel you need to push the fuel that's going to push the fuel. So it never ends. So in order for it to work, it has to be small. I remember being heartbroken as a kid in the actual Apollo days, because it looked like by the time I was 12, 13, 14, it looked like I was going to be at least 6 foot 6'1". I wasn't that tall yet, but I was headed there. And I remember people saying you can't be an astronaut if you're over 5'9" or 10 or whatever. They're really remarkably small guys, these Apollo guys. Buzz Aldrin's Somebody's going to tell me in a second how tall he is. I don't think he's much more than 5'9". He looks like he's about 5'9" to me. These are smaller guys. They had to be small. They had plenty of tall guys. They just couldn't use them. So somebody just said, what about inflatable habitats, Hyper-Ion team? Inflatable habitats are great. We'll talk about them next time. Inflatables are great, but you're still talking about moving stuff. And the more stuff you have to move, volume is weight. You've got to build the pressure shell, and you've got to build all of the electrical components and the water components, everything you build into that thing, and the stuff you put in it. Because if you're going to build it big, it's because you put stuff in it. No. Why? You have to get out of that idea, and you have to ask yourself the opposite question. Not why can't we make it bigger? You have to ask yourself, why is an airline lavatory so small? That's the question, right? Nobody likes it. I don't know how big people get in there, frankly. I'm a pretty slim guy, and I have a hard time. I'm 6'1". I have a hard time getting into an airplane lavatory. So you have to ask yourself, if it's so uncomfortable and so miserable, why is it so small? When in the economic interest of the airline and the comfort of the passengers, it'd be so much better if it were 2-3 times that size. Why is it so small? Well, part of the reason is, if you made it bigger, it'd be taking up payload. And payload is not as important. I mean, comfort's not as important. It's small because if it were much bigger, it would take up seats. But it can't be a whole lot bigger because you're not flying to use the lavatory. You're flying to get from point A to point B. So it's small and cramped because an airplane is limited by its diameter, and that has to be relatively small. And so think about this. Really what I'm trying to say is this, folks. I've done enough traveling as a result of this amazing life I have so that I am bloody tired of it. A 5-hour flight from LA to, because I live in LA, so I don't get the, going to the East Coast is as long as it's a long flight. So, I've done 5-hour flights more times than I can count. 3-hour flights are hard. 5-hour flights are really brutal. And I've done Australia and Thailand. Those are 12 and 14 and 18 hours. That's actually slightly different. You get into a whole different headspace there. But I've done an 18-hour flight. So basically what you're basically asking somebody if they want to live in space is, the question is, would you be willing to live on a 737 for the rest of your life? Because that's about the total area you're going to have, really. And I'm not. I'm willing to live on a 737 for a couple years, and I'd live on a 737 for a couple years if it was worth it. But when I'm done, I want to come back and I want to live in Montana or Wyoming. I want to come back and have fresh air and green and mountain lakes and birds. And I'm not a horse guy, but if it's good enough for James T. Kirk, it's good enough for Bill Whittle. I want to come home and have a life. And that's how I think we have to think about things, because I think that's going to be the reality of the social dynamics of it. Would I do 2 years on Ceres, cracking water for fuel? Yes, I would. I could do 2 years in a Spam can. I absolutely could do 2 years. I could probably do 3 or 4 years. I could certainly do it when I was 25, 30, 55 now. I'd do a couple years. Would I go to the moon in a can would I live in a 737 for 3 weeks to go to the moon? Are you kidding me? Of course I would. But I wouldn't want to live in a 737 for the rest of my life. I don't think most people would either. So when we talk about colonizing space, I think we're really talking about, I really think the attitude of flight crews in space will be very similar to the attitude of engineers who have to go to Saudi Arabia. I know a few guys who've gone to work in Saudi Arabia. And to me, it's the dynamic is exactly the same. You're going to Saudi Arabia? Yep. How long are you going to be there? I guess a military tour is more or less the same thing too, but I'm going to be there for 9 months. Really? Yep. Looking forward to it? No, I am not. Why not? Well, it's 190 degrees in the shade. You can't drink. You can't gamble. You can't have any fun. You don't do anything. Well, why are you going? I'm going to go for a limited amount of time, and I'm going to make 7 times what I make here, and then I'm going to come back with my money, and I'm going to make a life for myself. I'm going to endure it. I'm going to endure the hardship. Oil rigs, same exact thing. That's actually probably, I never thought of it before, but I bet you an oil rig is probably the perfect example of what space flight will be psychologically like. There are lots and lots of people who work on oil rigs, and living on an oil rig is not unbearable. In fact, over a limited amount of time, seems like it could be kind of fun in the same way that a sea cruise might be fun for a while. But living on an oil rig is something you can tolerate for a while. But I guarantee you there's nobody on this earth who got on an oil rig at age 25 and determined they were going to live on the rig for the rest of their life. Maybe there are, but they're not many. I just don't believe it. I think you go on an oil rig and you endure the hardships of it and the adventure and all that other stuff. You make a ton of money and you retire to someplace nice. I think that's pretty much the way it's going to go. I really think the way it's going to go. So, yeah, as somebody pointed out, who is it? Yeah, Guatemalan water snake, second rank Vasily Borodin. He wants to have seen Montana. It was the guy who died in Hunt for Red October. Sam Neill character. He was ready to defect to the United States. He's a submariner. He lives in a spam can under the ocean for 4 or 5 months at a time. But he's doing it so he can retire in Montana. I really think that's the way it is. I don't want to live on a 747 or a 737 for the rest of my life. I'll do years because I have a high motivation to see some of these things and experience them. But I won't live there forever. And I think most people feel that way. So anyway, the argument was, how do you sell space to people? I think in terms of the free frontier, which we'll talk about in part 2, you have to understand, if you're going to go to the American people, you're not selling them space. You're selling them pride. That's what you're selling. I think you have to be crystal clear about this, Jason. You're not selling them space. Space is actually a fairly boring environment. It's pretty uniform. Living in orbit would be cool. Being in orbit on the space station would be cool for about a week. And after that, I don't think I'd like it that much. And I think probably it'd be like Vegas. My first day in Vegas, woo. Second day in Vegas, like, I've seen it before. Third day, I will crawl over broken glass to get out of Vegas. Orbit would be amazing, and I'd sit there by the window, and I get the feeling I'd just be a lifelong dream for me. But after a week or two, certainly after a month or two, it'd be like, are we going to see anything different? We going anywhere? No, we're going to stay here. I'm ready to go home now. So I don't think you can sell them space. I don't think you can sell them the environment. I think you're selling pride. I think you're selling national pride. And what that really comes down to is, you can be proud about a lot of things in America, but I understand my people. I understand why Americans, half Americans or some number of Americans, loved the space program, thought that Apollo was the essence of America and that it was a high point of human civilization. Because when we talk about Apollo, we are talking about pride. A lot of people said it was a pride to beat the Soviets. There's no question beating the Soviets was a big part of that mix, but I don't feel like when I think of Apollo, when I think of Apollo, I don't even think of the Soviets. I think of the Soviets as being just another bunch of people watching us land on the moon. I don't think like, oh, we beat the Soviets. It's like, no, we did something much more important than that. Apollo was the living example of what we could do if we put our mind to it. That's why my favorite line in all of motion pictures ever is in Apollo 13 with, it's not my friend Gary Sinise's line, but it's in Apollo 13 with my friend Gary Sinise. And it's right at the beginning. It's right at the very beginning. They've just been at the party. They've watched Neil Armstrong land on the moon. Tom Hanks, who plays Jim Lovell, is sitting out back on a chase lounge, drunk with his wife. Drunk because he's happy. Drunk because we did it. He's going. He knows he's going. And he's lying there on a chase lounge, and he blocks the moon out with his thumb. And I think it's in voiceover. I don't remember exactly what the line is. It's pretty close to this. He says, so we landed on the moon. There wasn't anything magical about it. We just decided to go. That is the greatest line I have ever heard. That's it in a nutshell, right? That's it in a nutshell. Nothing magical about it. We just decided to go. It's so moving to me. It's so moving to me because it's just that simple. It's just that simple. It's the most impossible thing in the history of the world. It's nothing even remotely close to it has ever been attempted, let alone succeeded at. We just decided to do it. And so we did. And that's what you're ultimately selling when you talk about the free frontier, when you're talking about selling space to the American people. What you're really doing is you're selling them, you're giving them the Cadillac ad, which is a nice way to close this show. You're giving them the Cadillac ad. And what the Cadillac ad basically said about going to the moon was, America is such an amazing place that the most difficult thing, not only the most difficult thing ever done, but the most difficult thing imaginable, was kind of a piece of cake. And actually, once we did it, we were so good at it, we got bored. That's an amazing country. And I think ultimately, when you talk about making space sellable to Americans, I'm about to do it. People have asked about Free Frontier. We'll talk about it more in the future. I'm not going to... One thing I learned a lot from launching this website. I learned a lot about the mistakes we made launching this website. Learned a lot about disappointing people with product that was late. And I learned a lot. And I learned it on a genetic level. It hurt a lot. So what I learned about that is that I'm going to launch the Free Frontier when I have this movie ready, because I'm going to tie the movie into it. I'm going to have a movie that is a realistic vision of people in space using hardware that's not only possible, but has been around for 40 years. And when that movie's over, there's going to be a plaque up there, a little title up there that's basically going to say, if you want to do this for real, go to freefrontier.org. Today. You want to do it now? You want to do it? Let's do it. Let's go. So I'm waiting. It's a couple years out still. I got a couple movies I have to make before I can make Aurora. I can't do an $8 million movie off the bat. So I could do it if I had 80,000 members, but I don't have that many. So there it is. So it has to wait. But you're selling pride, and space is not the selling point. The final thing I'll say on this, and the final thing I'll say on the show tonight, is this. When you're talking about making the case to the American people for a space program, space is not a destination. Space is not like visit Tahiti, because Tahiti's beautiful and space is not. Space is space. There's nothing there. There are some beautiful vistas, but there's nothing in space. Space is the definition of nothing. So you're not selling space as a destination. You're not selling space as your friend. I think the way you sell it is you make space the enemy. You basically say, we are going now into the most dangerous frontier that has ever existed. You thought the Wild West was tough because there were bears and Indians and stuff. You stepped outside of your Conestoga wagon, you could breathe, and you could eat, and you could drink. Can't do any of that stuff out there. We got to do everything from scratch. This is 100,000 times more difficult than anything that has ever happened before. And the only people in the world that can pull this off is us. That's all. That's it. We are going to, in Aurora, they say this verbatim. They say this verbatim. We are taking this ship to Jupiter, not because Jupiter is an easy place to go. We're taking it to the hardest place to visit that we know of. Going to Jupiter it's not only distant. There are further places away, but it is the worst place in the solar system. We're going because it's the worst place. If we can get there and back, we can go anywhere. So we're going to do the hard thing first. We're going to do it not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I think that's what you do. You say to the American people, the essence of America is a frontier mentality. The essence of America is competence and skill and courage and intelligence and perseverance and guts. That's who we are. That's who some of us still are. Because I don't care about the rest of the rabbit people. They're not going to back this anyway. I've spent 40 years watching us cater and pander to them. No, I'm going after the Ks. And I'm going to... There it is. It's the toughest place there is. It's the hardest thing that we can do. And we're going to do it. And we're going to do it. We're going to make it look easy. And that activates something in people. Not everybody has this. Most people probably don't. But enough of us do. Certainly 10 million of us do. I bet it's many more than that. People like us understand that we live our lives in a sort of a coma and a dream, and that this business about us using 10% of our brains is actually not true at all. It's nonsense. But in terms of our potential, our human potential, we are idling. This car is idling. And not everybody wants to idle. Some people want to run. Some people want to run fast. Some people want to run. They want to see how fast they can go. And if they're going to fail, they're going to fail at something worth failing at. And they're going to fail in the company of the best people there are. And they're going to learn why they failed, and they're not going to fail next time. Or if they fail again, they're going to fail for a different reason. That appeals to a certain number of people. And that's how I would sell it, and I wouldn't try to get everybody on it. honestly, Jason. I don't waste time going after progressives. I don't want to convince them it's not worth it. They have emotional reasons for believing what they believe in, and I don't have time to waste changing their minds. The people whose minds I can change, those are the people I want to reach. So there's plenty of people in this country who would part with $10 a month to get this to happen if it was actually happening, if there was actual progress. And that's what I would sell. I'd sell the pride and progress. Ultimately, that's really it. When I was a kid, progress meant progress. It didn't mean further restrictions on speech. It didn't mean spying on us by the NSA. It didn't mean having the IRS weaponized. Progress didn't mean taking my money and giving it to a government that keeps most of it and then handling out 10% of what it takes to other people in order to buy their votes so they can have more power. That's not progress to me. Progress is not telling people what to think, and progress is not telling people what they can say, and progress is not setting your thermostats to 58 degrees in the winter, and progress is not a piece of crap car that gets 60 miles to the gallon because it has 2 cylinders, and progress is not sitting around raising money for the Guatemalan water snake. That's not progress. That's regress. Progress is about doing things that haven't been done before, building things that go faster than they've ever gone, higher, better, deeper, whatever. That's progress. That appeals to a certain number of people, and I'm one of them, and you are too. So I think this would be a good time to break it off at 2 hours and 23 minutes. We'll deal with part 2 next time. I've got plenty of questions to get us through, and we'll talk about space combat too, which is really fascinating stuff. Dun, 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 dun. We'll get there. Somebody has to. Might as well be us. If you haven't seen Get to Work, which is currently just pushed out on the Facebook page, it should be up on billwhittle.com. It's kind of a short take on this general attitude. Don't let these weenies and losers and incompetence and power-grabbing, base, venal liars ruin your day. So that's about it. I don't want to think about this too much because I don't want to get overly emotional. This may be, as I say, the last show from this particular location. If not, it will be the next last show. I'm virtually possible. Positive rather, the next one will come from the new place. But if it is in fact the last show out of this location, this would be 74 episodes we've done in this room, and 74, none of them were less than an hour. Most of them were 130, 140 hours of content. I think there's probably a solid 4 minutes in there somewhere. If somebody would like to edit that down, kind of peel through the 140, 150 hours that it's taken us in this room, I think there's a solid 2 or 3, 4 minutes in there somewhere, by God. So until next Tuesday, it won't be Wednesday. I'm traveling on Wednesday, but until next Tuesday, with the caveat that we may just have to bail because we're in the mid-move, but we'll be back the week after that. We'll do Space Part 2, and we'll, we'll get on it. Space Cadets. This is your space pilot wishing you happy landings. Jump in Jupiter. Look at the variometer out there. Our magnetic Gauss indications are showing that we're 6 radons higher than we thought we might be. So I'm gonna take over the command wheel and fire the retro rockets and see if we can get this baby down on the ground. And if it sounds like that for real, then it'd be even better, right? There's a movie to be made about steampunk, about Victorians colonizing space. And there's another movie to be made about the 50s future being real. But that's not for me. Or at least not for me right now. Anyway, thanks for joining us. As always, couldn't do any of this without you. Once we get the new facilities up and the daily content up, we're going to make a push for membership because I think by then we'll actually be able to have earned it. Those of you who are already members, again, I wouldn't be here without you. Thank you very much. For episode 74, I'm Bill Whittle. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.